Yo, what's good, Shinobi Nation? Welcome back to Narutoverse, the home of the craziest Naruto what-ifs. Today, we're diving into part 2 of What If Naruto and Team Tetsuo. Let that sink in. Make sure you stick around because once this starts, there's no turning back. If you're new here, smash that subscribe button, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video with your entire ninja squad. And don't forget to drop your theories in the comments because your support is what keeps this shinobi grinding. Now, let's jump straight into it. Naruto smiled when he saw Pakken enter the cave. He hadn't seen Kakashi's dogs all that often, but he'd met Pakken before and liked him. Aside from being one of Kakashi's better trackers, Pakken was probably the least threatening of the man's dogs. Non-threatening was good right now because he didn't want his new allies to be spooked and do something that couldn't be taken back as a result. He was reasonably sure that he had pegged his new allies correctly, but there was always the chance that he'd made a mistake. While he'd learned a lot about reading people throughout his life, especially over the last couple of years, he wasn't perfect. He'd made mistakes before and could do so again. He was reasonably sure that he was right in this case though, and as long as his current allies didn't feel too threatened by his team, things should be fine. Those amongst the criminal classes tended to divide into two categories. Those whose morals were slightly bent but drew the line at some things, and those who were beyond redemption and didn't draw the line anywhere. He had pegged this group as the sort who would draw the line somewhere and do their best not to cross it. These guys weren't the usual rabble that had left their villages for a life on the road as missing nin. They had a cause that had attracted someone like Haku, and the sort that remained loyal to a cause was slightly more likely to keep their promises than the sort that didn't. The fact that they were in a group and that they looked to have traveled together for a long while spoke well for his team's chances of survival because those who ran in packs tended to be less likely to turn on you unless they viewed you as a threat to their well-being, as those who traveled in packs tended to care for and be able to work with others, and since they had a support system were less likely to become paranoid wrecks. Since he'd allied himself with Zabuza's group, he had been doing his best to make sure his team wasn't seen as a threat and working hard to be seen as useful to them. The fact that he, Sasuke, and Sakura were still children in these people's eyes also helped to a degree. Based on the way the children who had been rescued alongside his teammates had been treated, these people would be less likely to harm those they perceived to be children. Despite the fact that until Pakken had shown up he'd been more hoping than certain that Kakashi and Tetsuo-sensei were alive, he had been frequently warning Zabuza's group about the Jounin, so they wouldn't become too startled when they arrived and do something everyone might regret. As long as Kakashi and Tetsuo-sensei were willing to hold up their end of the bargain, everything should turn out fine. One mission, and they could all part ways and never see each other again if they so chose. He'd miss Haku since he had been kind to him both times they had met, but he wasn't sure that he'd miss Zabuza or Mai. After happily greeting Pakken who had provided confirmation that both Kakashi and Tetsuo-sensei were alive and in good health, he pulled his marker out of his sandal and a small scroll from the storage seal in the other one. A civilian probably would have expected him to have kept spare weapons in those seals, but there was no point in doing so, since the old pulling a weapon from your shoe trick was so old that it was one of the first things a ninja knew to watch out for. It was a good place to covertly stash writing supplies for those times when your only hope might be getting a note out however. I'm beginning to see why it took 3 of the big 5 to bring Yuzu down. Gozu said appreciatively as he wrote out a note for Kakashi and Tetsuo-sensei. So kid, you carrying an armory in your underwear? Wouldn't you like to know? He replied as he wrote out that they were pretty much all fine and that coming in weapons drawn would put them in an untenable situation at the moment. Maizu, Renji, and Mai found his rejoinder to be uproariously hilarious for some reason. Their boisterous laughter woke the two kids who started panicking slightly, calling for their father and someone who was probably their nanny. Haku moved in to calm the two crying children who barely resembled the fat slob he'd run afoul of on the first day of the festival, as best as he could. As soon as he was finished with his note, he handed it over to Pakken to bring back to Kakashi. The instant he did so, Pakken raced out of the cave as fast as his little legs could take him, which meant that Kakashi and Tetsuo-sensei probably weren't in the mood to wait for him and were probably already gearing up to attack. Hopefully, the note would stop them from doing something rash before it ended in disaster as it was sure to do. Everything was as fine as it could be under such circumstances at the moment, and if it remained so, it'd be great. Zabuza watched as the Ninken departed. Up until now, he had thought that the boy had been lying about the pair of Jounin being on the way. The boy hadn't sounded convinced of the fact that his sensei and the other one who was most likely guarding the Uchiha while they were outside the village were alive, and he'd been reasonably certain that a group that had managed to successfully knock out said Jounin and escape with a trio of baby ninja, which Konoha ninja tended to be overprotective of. Wouldn't be stupid enough to leave the Jounin alive if they had them at their mercy. He'd apparently been wrong however. About the only reason that he had taken the brats on, aside from the fact that the next mission looked to be a tough nut to crack and that he would need all of the help he could get, including a bit of cannon fodder, had been because the blonde Uzumaki had helped Haku get out of Kiri alive when he'd gone to pass that message for him early this year, and he owed the kid who had so far done his best to hold up his end of the bargain rather than run out on them the first chance he got. He wasn't entirely sure what he would have done with whichever of the kids survived the next mission if the Jounin hadn't shown up, but he had leaned towards trying to convince them to join him through whatever means necessary because he couldn't afford to let them go and put the hunter Nin on their trail. Based on the pink-haired girl's reaction to them upon discovering that they were missing Nin, that was something at least one of them would be stupid enough to do should he let them go. The presence of Jounin made things more complicated and potentially made them easier as well. Jounin intended to know all about the sort of under-the-table deals that made the ninja world go round. Right now, trying to kill him or turn him in wouldn't be to their advantage since he was holding all of the bargaining chips. If he played his cards right, then it was possible that everyone would be able to walk away from the table alive and with something they wanted. And, as a bonus, the Jounin who should be well aware of the situation in Kiri might be inclined to give them a bit of a head start and possibly even distract any hunter Nin who might have picked up their trail in exchange for having rescued their precious genin from a bunch of unscrupulous kidnappers if they were the usual sort of bleeding heart leaf Nin. After a bit of a wait, the dog returned bearing a missive for the Uzumaki who was apparently team leader because he was the closest to being an actual ninja rather than being a brat who was playing at being a ninja like the pink-haired girl and the Uchiha who had tried to come across as tough but overplayed it and showed his almost complete inexperience were. After reading the note, the Uzumaki asked how he wanted to arrange the meeting, which was the opening of the bargaining session for all their lives. "You and I will go out and meet them, of course," he replied as he strapped his sword to his back. He'd selected the Uzumaki because he was sure that the kid would be less likely to do something stupid like run the instant he caught sight of his sensei. The kid seemed to have a good head on his shoulders and was lacking in nothing but experience. Haku had vouched for him, and Haku wasn't the sort to vouch for anybody without good reason. They both got up and exited the cave at the same time. When they got outside and onto the beach, the two Jounin were standing in the open waiting for them, apparently ready to bargain. His heart nearly stopped when he realized that one of those Jounin was Sharingan Kakashi the copy ninja, but who else would be entrusted with the teaching of the next to last Uchiha? Considering the Haddock's reputation, if it came down to a fight, there was a chance that none of them would survive. The brown-haired ninja that was there with the copy nin signed something at the Uzumaki who signed back. The Uzumaki's response apparently satisfied the man because he relaxed fractionally. "If you gentlemen would step inside my office," he said, gesturing at the cave and doing his best to seem unconcerned about the situation which could rapidly devolve into a total shitstorm if it wasn't one already. Ninja generally didn't kill unless they had to, and, considering the fact that he had Kakashi's students in what could arguably be considered captivity, the Konoha ninja might just decide that they had to. There was a bit of shuffling at the cave entrance as each of them did their best not to turn their backs on a potential enemy, but in the end, it was them who were in a lower bargaining position at this point and knew it who had entered the cave first, with him and the Uzumaki following close behind. Upon entering, both Jounin's eyes flicked across the cave, pausing briefly on the Uchiha, the pink-haired girl, and the two children, relaxing fractionally when they saw that all were in good health and that they didn't appear to be unduly stressed by their situation. As the Jounin were taking in the situation, he moved to an easily defensible spot in the cave where there was a good wall at his back and no corner to be backed into nearby. "Lamachi's Abusa," the copy ninja said eventually, taking on the role of spokesman. "You don't seem to be the sort to take on strays. If I think they're actually worth anything, I might," he replied, well aware of how his statement could be taken considering the multiple meanings of the word worth, especially in the current situation. Both Jounin's eyes involuntarily flicked towards the Uchiha, expected, and the Uzumaki, not expected, completely bypassing the pink-haired girl and the merchant's children, as if they were unimportant. Apparently, despite the fact that the Uzumaki clan was all but extinct and most of the sealing techniques they had been famous for were lost, the Uzumaki was actually worth something aside from his value as a ninja. "How much are they worth to you?" the brown-haired Jounin asked. "Not all that much really, but the Uzumaki brat did offer your services in exchange for the services we rendered to him, and I would like to receive the agreed upon payment," he replied, doing his best to sound casual despite the tense situation. "Besides, it'd be a bit too troublesome to try selling the Uchiha in my current position. It would attract all sorts of unwanted attention. As moving the possibility of him selling the Uchiha off to the highest bidder off the table should put the two further at ease and stop them from doing something drastic to get him back. As long as there was a chance of them doing so, they would probably keep towards non-violent approaches of negotiation. There was less of a chance of the Uchiha being accidentally killed in the crossfire that way. Exactly what are our services needed for? The copy ninja asked. Just your standard smash and grab on a crime lord's hideout. He replied. The client wanted them to be made an example of, so there's no real need to be neat about it, so long as we get the hostage out alive. And, after the mission we go our own ways and pretend we never met. The copy ninja said eventually. That was the general idea. He replied. Though if you have something else to offer, I would be open to bargaining. The pretend they never met bit was the most valuable part of the bargain at the moment, as far as he was concerned. While he needed cash and lots of it, he couldn't overthrow the Mizukage if he was dead, and with Hada Kakashi as an opponent, that was a very real possibility. With the head start that their teams pretending they never met would provide, he should be able to get away and find another lucrative job that would provide him with much needed funds. There were plenty of unscrupulous men with a lot of money out there who were perfectly willing to hire Missing Nin after all, and after his next mission was complete, there would be one less of them in the world. Yes, I suppose you do deserve some compensation for rescuing Shimura's Genin and Futaro Kanmaru's children and housing them for the night. The copy ninja said. We were offered a great deal of money to rescue that pig Futaro's little darlings, and it would be completely unfair of us to not share that pay with the people who did all of the heavy lifting. He almost collapsed in relief over the fact that the Haddock was willing to seriously talk business. Things could have turned into a massive bloodbath if he hadn't been, and he didn't only have himself to think about. The first to die in this situation would have been Gozu, Maizu, Renji, and Mai, as they were merely chunin and didn't have any special talents that were worth writing home about, and it would have been really crappy if they had followed him this far only to die now. As Kakashi and Zabuza bargained, the Hokage read the second letter that had come from that team that day. The first message he'd received that morning from Kakashi and Tetsuo, who had used the side-of-town messenger hawk which was reserved solely for emergencies, had been exceedingly worrying. This one, which had arrived via dog, was less worrying, but concerned him greatly nonetheless. Bargaining with Missing Nin was always a dangerous prospect. While as a whole, Missing Nin tended to be a mixed bag as far as morals and ethics were concerned, they were all willing to do what it took to survive, even kill people who had considered them to be their allies, if they thought it was necessary. While he was loath to do so, he would wait for another message from Kakashi to arrive before sending out a search party. A team of Anbu popping up at the wrong moment could turn what would otherwise have been a dangerous but otherwise relatively stable situation into a deadly one that could have catastrophic consequences for everyone involved, especially if Sasuke or Naruto were killed in the crossfire. Besides, there was a strong possibility that any team he sent right now would show up too late to be of any use, either too late because the team had already dealt with the situation, or too late because Naruto's team was dead, either way, too late. All he could do for the situation right now was wait. Wait and hope. Midokado Himura sighed as he watched his teammates sit there and do nothing. There had been a time when the man would have promptly taken action if he'd learned that a fellow Konoha ninja was being held captive by Missing Nin. Now however, the man was content to sit back and deal with the criminals as if they had any right of being bargained with rather than killed like the traitors to their village they were. He would have to do something other than to go to Danzo over this, as the man held enough leverage over him and didn't need more. This would be a bit difficult however because, unlike Danzo, he didn't have a private army of Anbu at his beck and call, and the regular Anbu had all been ordered to double-check all orders given to them by the council with the Hokage after the incident with Itachi. Speaking of Itachi, he wondered how the poor boy would feel if he learned that his precious little brother had been captured by Missing Nin. Danzo studied the situation report he'd received from the operative he'd had discreetly following the boys' team. The situation the boys' students were in was rather interesting to say the least, and he would continue to follow it to see how it would play out, considering the fact that the group that the weapon had allied himself with was apparently gearing up to remove a minor thorn from his side. Of course, Mamachi's Zabuza had the potential to become an even bigger thorn in his side later on, but at the moment, he was useful. Not only had the man removed a couple of problems before he had been forced to deal with them, but the search for him also tied up a small portion of Kiri's forces. Despite the fact that he had no intention of doing so and was doing this for his own reasons, Zabuza was doing him and Konoha a favor. If that group of criminals who had made their base in Hotwater Country weren't gotten rid of soon, it was possible that the small coastal nation would be taken over by them and return to being a militarized state, as that was one of the leader's stated goals. This would of course not be helpful to Konoha, as the demilitarization and subsequent restructuring of Yugakure had removed one of the threats that constantly surrounded the village. Despite the violent reputation that preceded them, Zabuza's band was a bunch of political dissidents rather than the usual criminal trash that became Missing Nin. That didn't mean that they wouldn't kill if doing so would further their cause though. From the reports that he'd compiled on the man who might have a chance at becoming Mizukage upon Yugura's death, he had learned that Zabuza had a sense of honor and something of a soft spot for children. Both of these traits were things that the weapon, who had been smart enough to use all available resources in order to ensure his team's survival, could use to his advantage. So far, things had been stable in regards to the boys' team situation and looked to remain that way for the immediate future. It wouldn't do to do something rash and risk losing the weapon, especially not when the weapon and the group he was with were preparing to take out a threat to Konoha's security. He would send a team with orders to not interfere unless the situation looked to be becoming untenable. Otherwise, there was no point in risking Konoha's valuable resources, especially in a situation that might sort itself out by the time the team got there sometime tomorrow. Deal. Kakashi said, offering his empty hand for the leader of the group of missing nin, now that they had reached an accord that both had found reasonable. The other man briefly took his hand. Their hands clasped for a shake for an instant before they simultaneously let go, not wanting to be in the other's prime killing range any longer than necessary. Both had acquired international reputations for being indiscriminate killers, though, considering what Zabuza had done to earn his moniker, his reputation had been well deserved. I was thinking we'd go in tonight. Zabuza said as he moved to a spot that was more comfortable for him. The sooner we get this done and get gone, the better. What's the plan? He asked, hoping that the other man had something other than rush in, kill everybody, and hope the hostage was still alive when they reached him. We're still working on that. The man named Renji said. We've mostly got one hammered out, but we need a few details filled in. The man rather pointedly looked at the prisoner the group had taken, making his meaning very clear to everyone including the moron who had thought he could get away with drugging and kidnapping Konoha ninja. The almost eager look in Sasuke's eyes when the man had made that statement unsettled him slightly. If the kid wasn't already well on his way to becoming a basket case, he would introduce him to Ibiki. The two of them would probably get on like a house on fire. Over near the fire, Shimura and Maizu were bundling the small children in preparation for travel. It had been agreed that one ninja from each team would bring the children back, so there would be no accusations of underhandedness when it came to collecting and distributing the promised pay for the children's safe return. After the pay was given, Shimura would send Konoha's share back to Konoha along with a report so all of the proper paperwork could be filled out and the pay distributed correctly according to mission pay guidelines. Hopefully, Shimura would be able to get there and back before they started the raid on the crime boss's base, which was located in the far southern end of the country. While he was gone, they would be interrogating the prisoner and preparing for tonight's mission. Since Sasuke was so eager to join in on the torture, he thought he'd let him. It would probably be better to see how the kid reacted to blood now, since it'd just suck if he was stuck rescuing the boy because he'd had some sort of flashback in the middle of the base attack and froze up or went psycho or something. So, which one of you lot is going to do the interrogation? He asked. That'd be me. The woman named Mai replied. Mind if my student joins in? He asked. Sasuke seems to think he needs a little experience in that area. Sure. Mai said with a sweet smile that frankly scared the crap out of him. I'll be sure not to scar him too badly. He snickered at Sasuke's nervous swallow as the boy followed Mai over to the prisoner. Several hours into the interrogation, Sasuke was doing his best not to throw up. Hearing about these kinds of things as they were being bantered about over drinks when mom was away was one thing, actually seeing them being done was something else entirely. Was this why his father had hated his job with the police? If so, why did he brag about these things with his officer relatives when he had a few drinks in him? The interrogation had started out simply, with words, then with words and the occasional blow and/or offer thrown in amongst the questioning. The prisoner had remained silent throughout it all. Then things got violent and had later started moving beyond mere violence into something that was purely sadistic until finally the prisoner began to speak. Throughout it all, Mai had kept smiling like it was just a game to her. He however had wanted to leave several times but hadn't managed to muster up the courage to do so for fear of having the woman's attention be turned towards him. There was blood on the walls and the floor of the small side cavern they had commandeered for the interrogation and the prisoner was making small keening noises, begging to die. Well little boy, it's time you became a man. Mai said as she handed him a kunai. He looked down at the kunai and at the prisoner who was barely recognizable as a human being now. He hesitated. He'd never killed a person before and when he'd imagined doing so, as he frequently did in regards to Itachi, it had not been like this. He felt shame over hesitating. He was a ninja, he was supposed to kill. What sort of ninja would be reluctant to kill when it was part of their job? Finish it. The woman said. He moved slightly shakily to the prisoner who was bound to a rock and brought the kunai down, closing his eyes as he did so. Next time, don't close your eyes little boy. You could get killed that way. Mai said as she pulled the kunai from his unresisting fingers when the deed was done. As he entered the main cavern where the rest of the group sat waiting, he found himself wondering if this had been how Itachi had gone mad. Anbu were required to do worse things than normal ninja in the course of their jobs. As he sat down, he found himself looking over at his teammates who were seated huddled together, going over some aspect of the plan. Sakura seemed to notice that he was looking at them first. When she caught sight of him, there was horror in her eyes. But Uzumaki looked up next. Rather than looking at him in horror, he looked at him in understanding. Kakashi, however, the look in the man's eyes was completely blank. "Well then, that just leaves Sakura," the silver-haired man said with a shrug before going back to the map that the trio had been huddled over. As he sat there wondering why he couldn't be so casual about death, the boy who had handed him his breakfast that morning sat down next to him. "What do you want?" he asked, wishing the boy would go away and leave him alone. "My first time wasn't all that easy either, neither was every time after," the boy who had made no move to leave said. "There's something wrong with you if it is. You do it though because you have to." "Tell that to that bastard who slaughtered my clan," he snorted. "Did it because he had to?" "Yeah, right. That bastard did it because he was nuts, and if he ever found the SOB who had helped him, he was dead meat too. Even if killing made him want to puke his guts up. When people don't have something precious to hold on to, a reason for doing, a reason for being, they get lost," the boy said quietly. "Sometimes they find someone who will give them a path and find the strength to find their way back, and sometimes they remain lost and have to be put down for the safety of others. You can't hold on to people, they turn out not to be what you thought they were, they leave, or worse, they die," he replied, snorting at the thought that the Itachi he'd grown up with was merely lost somewhere. "That's why you become strong enough to hold on to them for as long as you can," the boy replied. "It is when you have someone precious to protect that you become truly strong. You have to in order to keep them and keep them safe. If you have no one to fight for, you become lost and lose sight of everything including yourself. Avenging my clan will be enough," he replied, wanting to end the conversation that was making him feel uncomfortable. "And what would you do and who will you have at your side when you have avenged your clan?" the boy asked curiously. "If you chase everyone away like you do now, you will find yourself standing alone with nothing to do and nothing to be afterward, and you will be completely empty. I myself may be nothing but Zabuza-sama's tool, but at least I am something, and I have someone precious to me to be that for." But that, the other boy got up and left, leaving him to think things he had never even wanted to consider before alone. The truth was, while he had paid lip service to a desire to restore his clan, he hadn't really thought of the future, besides becoming strong enough to defeat that man and avenging his clan. He had told himself that he would think of the after when it came. But, what if that day that could be years down the line that he was waiting for turned out to be too late like the other boy had said it would? "Unbefreaking-believable," Tetsuo said as he settled down near the fire in the cave that served as the hideout for Mamachi Zabuza's little gang, setting the pack he'd carried back from Saida down at his side. He'd been running all day, and while he could keep it up for another day or so without too much hardship under normal circumstances, it wasn't fun, and these weren't quite normal circumstances. He'd been forced to recover from being drugged on his feet and then forced to deal with the situation back in Saida. As a result, he felt almost completely drained, which wasn't good considering the coming mission. As he sat down, Maizu, who was a bit bloodthirsty but otherwise not that bad of a person, settled down next to his twin brother Gozu, who made up the other half of the moderately famous demon brothers. It was clear that he was rather drained from their ordeal as well. The man had gone through a battle and then ran half the night before being forced to turn around run all day and before being stuck dealing with the Saida townsfolk. Unlike him, the poor bastard was just a chunin, and it showed. "So?" Zabuza asked expectantly. "That damn merchant stiffed us and riled the town against us," Maizu said angrily. "I'd have killed him, but the bleeding heart leaf nin stopped me." He caught the expression on Zabuza's face and knew it would mean trouble if he didn't deal with it quickly. Konoha's methods of dealing with such situations were generally seen as far too lenient, but they were usually effective, especially when the big bad ninja didn't go after the dissidents right away and let the situation blow over, as the average slob stopped seeing the point in trying to fight against someone who didn't even bother to give them the time of day. And realized that the bastards who'd been stirring them up were just rabble-rousing and that there was no real threat from Konoha. Usually, long before the unrest reached dangerous levels, the leaders of the crowds tended to be discredited in the eyes of their followers, who then abandoned their cause, as there apparently wasn't one. Then, when people started forgetting about their former and now disgraced leaders, Konoha dealt with the bastards who had tried to turn their customer base against them. It wouldn't do to overly frighten, alienate, or kill off the customer base, otherwise there would be nobody to pay for missions, and Konoha would go broke. If Konoha went broke, they'd all starve. As if we'd be so merciful as to kill him now while he's still got everything, especially so soon after he riled up our customers who'll become unsettled if the fat bastard dies or disappears too soon," he replied with a slight scoff. I'm sure the nice townsfolk of Saida are having fun burying the corpses you guys left behind right now, and in a few days, when that fat slob pisses one too many of them off, they'll remember us and start eagerly waiting for us to deal with him, considering the fact that they'd watched him stiff us after we'd returned his kid safe and sound. Then, when they've all turned against that Lardis, we'll start taking it out of his hide nice and slow. That sounds like fun, but I'm still out my share of the rescue money. Zabuza replied. We'll find a way to compensate you. He replied. Konoha has some sort of discretionary fund for these sorts of things, and I could send a message back to indicate that we need some money from it. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to hand my comrade some of our supplies that I got from the inn. He said as he handed the pack he'd retrieved from the Saida Inn to Naruto. What about my bag? Sasuke asked. Had to leave it behind to prove to the guys at the inn that we intended to return in a few days as promised. He said as Naruto dug through his bag and pulled out a storage scroll and frowned when he didn't recognize it. I made sure to pull out anything you might miss beforehand though in case the idiots get any bright ideas. Naruto chucked the strange scroll at Kakashi who opened it and tossed it to Sasuke as Naruto tossed another scroll he didn't recognize at him and a scroll that contained the medical supplies at Sakura who, fortunately, hadn't had them on her when she was captured. The reason he had gotten Naruto's pack rather than Kakashi's or his own was because it made the best sense to do so. Currently, there were only 2 seals that Naruto was an expert at making, and that was because the boy practiced with them so often and in such unorthodox ways. The boy was capable of making high-quality explosive tags and could do things with storage seals that other people swore were impossible. As a result of Naruto's skill with storage seals, his bag was practically a work of art. Aside from the supplies he kept stashed inside the bag, there was a set of spare supplies in the bag itself. Looks like everything's here except my apartment. Naruto said after he'd finished examining the supplies that had been packed. Yeah, I kinda had to leave your furniture behind because I couldn't see how it would be useful for the job. He replied. Replacing the lost furniture should the innkeepers back inside do something stupid would be a rather expensive undertaking for the boy but he would find a way to make it up to him somehow if the bastards at the inn destroyed his stuff because that fat merchant who could afford to buy Naruto enough furniture to fill 100 apartments had rather stupidly decided to save a few 100,000 ryo by stiffing a team of ninja. If Naruto's belongings became damaged, they'd be yet another thing that Konoha would be taking out of that Lardis's hide. You'd better get ready because we're going to leave in an hour. Kakashi said as he leaned back to rest again. Crap. He said as he pulled his sandals off in order to rub his sore feet. Well, the sooner we get going, the sooner we get this done. Kakashi said as he pulled a dark bandana over his unruly and easily recognizable silver locks. I'll fill you in on what you're supposed to be doing. Sakura swallowed nervously as she took in the small compound that her team was going to be raiding alongside a group of missing nin. Since this was an unofficial mission and Konoha couldn't be implicated if something went wrong, all of them had been forced to leave their headbands and dog tags back in the cave. If she died here, there was a chance that nobody would ever know what had happened to her. This was going to be her first bit of combat experience and she'd been ordered to hang back alongside the missing nin's medic with the medical supplies so they didn't get caught up in the thick of things and potentially get themselves killed in the crossfire. She didn't know whether to be relieved or disappointed that she was being kept out of the action. On the one hand it showed that Tetsuo-sensei didn't think her capable of handling this mission and still saw her as a liability. But on the other hand, it meant that she wouldn't have to kill anybody just yet. She wondered how she would react if she actually killed someone. Sasuke had looked so wrong when he had come back from interrogating their prisoner, whose screams had echoed throughout the cave for so long, before Kakashi put up some sort of genjutsu that had made her unable to hear them. There was also something that had gone missing from Naruto since he had graduated from the academy and she was reasonably sure she knew why. What would killing someone take from her if she did it like the other two and just about every other ninja from Konoha for that matter had done? After what seemed like an eternity, the signal that the medics were needed came. She and Haku raced into the compound which may or may not have been cleared yet. Based on the urgency of the signal given, someone was badly injured. She hoped and prayed that it wasn't a member of her team as she ran, feeling sick as she took in the sight of the dead bodies that had been strewn in her path as she trailed after Haku, who was much faster than she was. When she reached the group, it was to find Renji cradling his wife Mai, who was so badly injured that she didn't even know where to begin, while Naruto did everything he could to stop the bleeding. Haku apparently knew what to do however, because he started calling for supplies. Soon, things settled into a pattern where Haku asked for some medical supply whose name she only knew from the inventory book that had come with a med kit and she handed it to him. As Haku worked furiously to save his patient, everyone in the group, which included a boy she didn't recognize, nervously waited to see whether or not Mai would survive. Renji, who hadn't stopped pacing, was the most anxious of the lot. When Haku had started treating Mai, the man had sworn that if she died, he would follow. She had little doubt that the man would carry through on his promise. Despite the fact that the two seemed to be polar opposites personality-wise, it had been obvious from the first moment she had seen them that they were both very much in love with each other. The two of them were passionate about each other in a way that reminded her of the stories in the books she had a habit of sneaking out of her mother's closet, and if the two of them had been characters in such a novel, it would quite likely have been a love story for the ages. Eventually, after hours of work, Haku had set Mai's broken leg with Naruto's assistance and either closed or bandaged all of her open wounds. Though it wasn't advisable considering Mai's injuries, the team very carefully got her ready to move because they couldn't hang around here any longer because someone was eventually going to drop by and investigate. It was uncertain whether or not Mai would survive, but her chances of survival were far better than they would have been had Haku not had the assistance and supplies her team had provided. The trip back to the cave that had served as the missing nin's base was far slower and more careful than the trip out had been, and as a result she hadn't had to be carried. Instead, she followed along with the litter, doing her best to keep an eye on Mai's condition, all the while praying that she survived. This hadn't been the sort of introduction to the practical aspects of being team medic that she had wanted, but it was the one she got, and she would have to deal with it. Zabuza watched anxiously as Mai was gently lowered to the cave floor near the fire. He'd lost enough members of his group already, and if Mai went, so too would Renji. Renji and Mai had been in love since they were children, and neither knew how to live without the other. Either way, as things stood, he was going to lose Renji and Mai. Whether or not it would be temporarily or permanently depended on Mai's survival. Should Mai live, the group would be separating until Mai recovered enough to be able to join them without slowing them down too much. Renji would naturally be staying by her side until that day came. All things considered, the mission had gone better than it would have done had the Leaf Ninjas not been there. While they could have handled it on their own, there would almost certainly have been at least one fatality amongst the group. One of the fatalities would have almost certainly been Mai, who had only survived to this point because Sharingan Kakashi himself had gotten between Mai and the opponent who was killing her. It had been Mai's bad luck and eagerness for battle that had caused her to be stuck facing the only Jounin level ninja in the compound alone. The leader of the criminal organization may have been retired from active duty as a ninja, but that hadn't stopped him from being a ninja. The man, who did a back way out of the base, had kept his skills sharp over the years and had still been in excellent shape. It should have been him who had gone up against him, but it hadn't been, and because it hadn't been, Mai and Renji could still die. Naruto sighed as he flopped backwards onto his sleeping roll which he'd laid out after he changed his clothes and washed up a bit in order to catch a few hours of sack time before they left sometime after dawn and headed back to Saida, where they weren't going to be getting a warm welcome upon their return thanks to a certain merchant whose kids had been the reason his team had been drugged and kidnapped and several of the Saida children had died in the first place. It had been a rather insane evening and not one that he was likely to get over anytime soon. He hadn't run a mission like that in ever. He'd killed before as part of his job but not like this. It wasn't just the killing that had made the mission so intense, though he had killed more people during this mission than he had in the entire 2 years he'd been a ninja, but the fact that he'd been going up against a horde of other ninja, knowing that he was going to be outnumbered and quite possibly outclassed. When they had gotten to the compound, it had rapidly become apparent that the leader of that little kidnapping for ransom ring that they were going up against had been setting up his own ninja village and manning it with the dregs of ninja society. While a large percentage of the ninja there were washouts, not all of them had been, and the group had been hard-pressed to survive because numbers had been very firmly on the enemy's side. In fact, numbers had been so heavily in the enemy's favor that it was ridiculous. The compound was larger than he had expected it to be based on the number of ninja who had been hired to storm it. It was roughly the size of a small town and looked to have a population of at least 100. As he was beginning to doubt that they could do this, a chilling mist rose from a small nearby pond and kept rising until the area was blanketed with a near impenetrable fog. That was their cue to start. They would run silent for as long as they could. They ran from house to house, killing every adult they found. He felt sick over the possibility that many of the adults here could have been innocent civilians who'd been drawn here by false promises, but he couldn't take the chance that, in sparing one of the people in these houses, he would be leaving behind a ninja who could then turn around and stab him or one of his teammates in the back. It had all been his least favorite kind of fighting as well. He hated straight-up fighting in areas where he hadn't gotten a chance to set up traps beforehand, and the enemy had an intimate familiarity with the terrain and every opportunity to do so. The first clue that anyone had that they were there had been when either Gozu or Maizu, he had a hard time remembering which of the two was which, had set off a basic trap. An instant after the explosion, the compound burst into frantic activity like a kicked-over anthill. Everything got blurred and jumbled after that. 1 second he was sinking his kunai into the gut of a man who had probably never risen above the rank of genin before he'd washed out of his village's ninja forces. The next, he was slashing the throat of a man who was trying to release something into the air, probably more of that drug that had been used on Saida. After that, he was leaping off of a rooftop and struggling with a ninja who had a headband with the stricken through symbol of the village of Frost on it on the way down to the ground. Mai had been the one who had reached the boss's luxurious, if a little small, home first, and had been the one to follow him into his escape tunnel before the door had shut and locked. By the time he had blown the lock, the bastard who had been surprised as hell to see them had been toying with Mai for a long while, taking out his frustration over the destruction of his criminal empire Kun Ninja village out on her. It had been that frustration that had been the only reason Mai had still been alive when they had reached her, and Kakashi had joined the fight, killing the bastard who had been killing Mai by inches. The lock had been some sort of picture puzzle lock like the ones on the instructor's lunchboxes at the academy, but more complex. If he could figure out how to take the picture apart, he would be able to get into the tunnel Mai, and the boss of this place had gone down like he had gotten into the instructor's lunchboxes. There had to be a key to it that he was missing. There. Now if he could just figure out how to. Hop. He and the others ran down the tunnel the instant the door opened. Mai was still trying to fight back despite the hopelessness of the situation she was in. They all ran to help. Kakashi got there first. As Kakashi fought, Renji raced over to his wife's side and held her as she lost consciousness. As he drifted off to sleep, he could hear the cries of the dying men and the screams of the few children living in the compound who had woken up to find one or both of their parents dead. He never wanted to take a mission like this again. Each time he killed, it felt as if a piece of him died with his opponent. Tonight, it felt like a large chunk of him had been removed. He could understand killing an enemy before they killed you, and he could understand killing to protect the village or something that was precious to you, but what he had done last night hadn't been the same. Not by a long shot. As Naruto struggled to sleep and eventually fell into a nightmare, Sasuke stood in the ocean trying to scrub the blood from his skin and clothing, not caring if a long period in the salt water he was washing in damaged his skin which was already starting to burn, and almost wishing that one of the waves that crashed against him would roll over his head and drag him out to sea. The mist had completely lifted by the time they had exited the boss's house with the boy that the missing nin had been hired to retrieve. He had found the boy in an upstairs room when he had been helping clear the house, while Naruto had been occupied with a lock to the boss's hidden escape tunnel, which could come out anywhere since they hadn't found the other end during their run through the compound. Without the mist to obscure them, the bodies practically stood out in the light of the three-quarter moon. The sight of the bodies brought back memories that he had spent the last 4 years either trying to forget or to remember in greater detail, as incentive to drive him further, depending on what he was doing at the time. The thing was, this time, he had helped do it. He had helped do it, and though he was mostly sickened and horrified by what he'd done, a small part of him had liked it. Throughout the trip back, he couldn't get over the stench that came from the blood that had clung to his skin and clothing, the way it had 4 years ago, when he had run from body to body hoping and praying that one of his aunts, uncles, or cousins who had been strewn about the compound like garbage was alive. The instant they had reached their destination, he had run into the water, not caring about the risk of undertow dragging him from shore, and started scrubbing the blood off. As he scrubbed, he wondered if he had gotten lost somewhere. He had to have even considered enjoying the killing he had done the way that he had enjoyed killing the clan. The person he had been before it had happened would have been absolutely horrified by the thought of killing someone and throwing their body aside like trash, not felt the rising sense of satisfaction at a job well done that began to eat away at the horror he had felt. As Kakashi replaced his hit he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He'd always hated going on the sort of unofficial missions which Konoha may need to disavow, mainly because they were the sort of mission that left you the most messed up afterward. He was worried about Sasuke's mental state. The boy had been exceedingly vicious in battle, and afterward. Well, the boy had currently been in the water over an hour and was still scrubbing his skin raw. Sighing, he got up and waded out to where the boy was scrubbing the skin off his arm with a handful of sand. He grabbed the boy's arm and forced him to drop the sand before he picked him up and carried him to shore. Shimura, who looked about twice as tired as he felt, was there waiting with a blanket. As soon as the boy was ashore, he and Shimura wrapped the boy in the blanket and carried him back into the cave. The boy made several choking noises and he got out of the way in case the kid vomited, as that was a common reaction after such a battle. It was apparent that shock had delayed his reaction so far and the boy was finally beginning to process what he had done. When the boy failed to vomit, he got close enough to get a good look at the kid's face. He was crying. Sighing, he wrapped his arms around the boy and pulled him close, like he had done for a number of his Anbu teammates after similar missions. The boy needed someone to be there for him right now the way Minato-sensei had been there for him the day he'd lost his first two teammates, and the day he'd lost his father, and the day he'd lost Obito. He'd be that person right now. He had to be, since the child sensei was too mentally and physically exhausted to deal with the situation right now and was practically dead on his feet at the moment. Sasuke wasn't nearly as tough as he tried to convince himself as well as everyone else he was. It was a pity that the boy had had to learn that the hard way this evening. Itachi frowned slightly when he awoke to find the crow he'd left in Konoha in case the council needed him for something coming in for a landing. The bird landed by his side as he sat up and he took the note it had been carrying in its beak. The handwriting was Himura's, which was highly unusual because every other time he'd been contacted, it had been either by the Hokage or Danzo. Not that he'd been contacted all that often over the last 4 years. Curious, he broke the seal. He almost acted in an uncharacteristic manner when he had read the contents of the note that the crow had brought him. His precious brother who was supposed to be safe in Konoha raking leaves, walking dogs, and training to kill him, had been captured by missing nin on a C rank gone wrong. Rather than sending someone out to rescue his brother, the Hokage had decided to sit back and wait for things to play out. According to the letter, his brother's last known location had been somewhere outside the small border town of Saida, which he'd not heard of before since it was too small and remote to bother marking on a map. Sighing because he hated violence and because violence would undoubtedly be necessary in this situation, he got up and headed off towards his brother's last known location. Fortunately, he was in southern lightning country near the border of frost, so the journey wouldn't be as far as it would have been were he in, say, the river country base for instance. What's going on? Kisum, who had been woken by his departure, asked when he finally caught up to him. Nothing. He replied. Just some personal business I need to take care of. Will there be fighting? Kisum asked almost eagerly. Yes. He replied, almost looking forward to the upcoming violence just this once. Count me in. Kisum said giving him a razor to the grin. I'd rather not. He replied. He hadn't told Kisum about Sasuke yet and considering how the other man felt about lies, there was no way of knowing how his partner would react to his lie of omission. You don't have a choice. Kisum replied, continuing to follow him. Kakashi smiled as the messenger hawk arrived with the requested funds and an order to return to Konoha for a debriefing. Of course this would cause them to miss the mission to provide babysitting services for a nobleman who was attending a darts tournament and the controlled burn in a bit of parkland in the north and throw all of their other missions into question, but after a mission like the last one, they all needed a little downtime and the kids would need some counseling. Unless it was during wartime and they had no other options, Genin almost never ran missions like this. So much for the Chunin exams in January, but at least they all got out of this alive and in one piece. He handed the money the hawk had brought to Zabuza, who was the leader of the little group of missing nins, concluding their business. The danger was past and all that was left was to go home. They had fulfilled their end of the bargain and the man had found no reason to complain about their pay or services. I hope we never see each other on the opposite side of the battlefield. Zabuza said before turning back to the cave that served as the group's hideout. There was no goodbye but, then again, ninja didn't often say goodbye as it was bad luck. They'd usually say something along the lines of see you later or till we meet again. As Zabuza had no intention of seeing them again however, that had served as his farewell. He wouldn't be saying goodbye to the other man either, so it all evened out. He would not be giving the cave's location to anyone when he reached civilization, despite the fact that giving the information would be pointless. He had little doubt that should he direct anyone to the cave, the group would be long gone by the time anyone he might tip off got there. Zabuza and the rest of his group were already packed and, hours earlier, the demon brothers had carried Mai off to parts unknown, where she would be accompanied by her husband Renji until she was well enough for them to rejoin their group. The only thing giving the location of the cave would betray the trust that their brief companions who had saved Naruto, Sakura and Sasuke had given them and he had no intention of doing so. As Zabuza disappeared into the cave, his team started their own disappearing act in a sideward direction. Based on Shimura's account of his and Maizu's treatment in Saida, he knew better than to expect a warm welcome from the inhabitants. It was somewhat understandable, considering the deaths of the small children and the fact that the people of Saida needed someone to blame. Unfortunately, before blame could be turned where it was due, someone had stepped up and pointed the blame squarely at his team. Konoha would deal with the situation later on but that wouldn't be helping them now. When Itachi and Kisum reached Saida, where their trail supposedly began, it was to find some overweight and far too richly dressed merchants standing in the town square, sermonizing on how ninjas were the source of all the trouble in the world and that things would only improve if they were all gotten rid of. Kisum looked like he wanted to kill the man sheerly out of principle. Leave it, Kisum. He said. We don't have time. Don't have time for what? Kisum, who was still reaching for his sword, asked. you never told me where we're going. He didn't reply, choosing instead to follow the first trail out of town he spotted that looked like it had been made by ninjas, and from the looks of things, this particular trail had had frequent ninja traffic on it recently. After following it for a while, he reached a clearing in the woods which contained a few wrecked and run-down buildings and a number of freshly dug graves. He barely restrained himself from racing over to the graves and frantically digging to make sure that Sasuke wasn't in one of them, as that would just serve to further fuel Kisame's suspicions and give something away to Madara should he be watching. Struggling to keep a sedate pace, he moved over to the graves and used an earth jutsu that he'd once copied in order to bring the corpses to the surface. He did his best not to slump in relief when he saw them. None of them were Sasuke. Since a couple of them were wearing Hitai 8 marked with the symbol of the now defunct Yugakure, and another one was wearing a stricken through frost symbol, he felt that it was safe to assume that these had been the missing nin who had captured his younger brother. He could now see why the Hokage hadn't sent out assistance. By the time that Himura had received word that Sasuke had been captured, the Hokage must have received word that the situation had already been dealt with. It would seem that the fight's already over. He said as he reburied the corpses. He would of course be tracking Sasuke down before he and his team arrived in Konoha in order to make sure he was alright. Whether or not he stayed out of sight would depend on his brother's mental state. If the boy seemed broken by his experience, he would do anything it took in order to motivate him to survive and grow stronger. He had to. When he was gone, Madara wouldn't show his brother any mercy otherwise. The weak Sasuke would very soon be a dead Sasuke, and he couldn't have that. Shin sighed as he, his friend who had yet to be named since the name he'd previously had been discarded, and the team they'd been following reached Saida, where Team Tetsuo would be picking up the rest of their supplies before heading back to Konoha. After running flat out for an entire day and night to get there, he and the little guy had followed Team Tetsuo back from the cave where they and a group of missing nin from Mist had been holed up after what looked to have been an exceedingly difficult mission. Both he and his training partner who would be forced to fight him soon were exhausted, and it was beginning to show. When they'd arrived back in Saida, Team Tetsuo had received a welcome that was far less warm than the one they deserved, considering the fact that they had done something that had quite likely saved the town in the long run. Any would-be conquering army that came through the hot water border would have run through the small town first on their way into fire country, and a guy who had been confident enough to try building a hidden village under everyone's noses would be the sort who had the balls to try invading another country if he thought he might get away with it and the ego to believe that he would get away with it. As Team Tetsuo left Saida with their packs which, fortunately, the innkeepers hadn't been stupid enough to try destroying out of fear of whatever traps they might contain, the merchant who was so fat that he was surprised the man could even walk, decided to gather the townspeople in order to give the team a sending-off party with rocks. That was going just a little too far. It wouldn't be fair to kill the townspeople who had been duped by the lies of a man who had thought he could get out of paying the ninja by sending a mob after them, but he had to neutralize them somehow. Coming up with what he thought was a brilliant idea, but one the little guy and Danzo-sama would more than likely consider idiotic, he shined over to the side of the merchant who was at the head of the mob. "Throw that rock and Danzo-sama will expose your involvement with the underground slave market," Shin said to the fat merchant who was trying to stir up civil unrest in a theatrical whisper that he was certain had carried to over half of the mob which was standing behind them. The merchant dropped his rock in surprise, indicting himself in the eyes of the listening public. Whether or not the man was actually involved in the underground slave market, he had just destroyed his credibility in the eyes of the Saida townspeople. The villagers who stood immediately behind the merchant looked at him in disgust and, from the looks of it, were prepared to throw their rocks at the merchant rather than the departing ninja. As he vanished and reappeared by his training partner's side, a whisper started going up through the crowd. Apparently, a number of the townspeople had been involved in the burial of a group that had been associated with the group that Team Tetsuo had assisted the missing nin from Kiri in taking out. The merchant had claimed that the Konoha nin had been in on it with that group and had turned around and betrayed them when they felt it was convenient to do so. But, with the allegedly slave-trading merchant's word in question, people were beginning to wonder what really happened, especially considering the fact that someone had remembered seeing one of the ninja children being kidnapped as they lost consciousness. There were also grumbles from a group of stallkeepers and cider manufacturers who had apparently either been stiffed by the merchant or had been given raw deals by him. It was amazing how much rich people felt compelled to steal despite the fact that they had more than just about everyone else. The sad thing was that people who would chase a poor man who stole a crust of bread to the ends of the earth tended to let them. The mob began to disperse and head back to their homes, save for a few who looked very much like they wanted to chase the merchant who had turned them against a ninja who had avenged the deaths of a number of their children out of town. And that pipsqueak is how you correctly neutralize a threat with words. He signed to his pale partner whose dark hair and dark eyes made him look even paler than he actually was. You want to help me plant the evidence proving that that asshole who tried getting away with stiffing ninjas and turning a town against us is involved in a bunch of illegal shit. He signed as they walked off. Gladly. The little guy signed back. Rather than follow Team Tetsuo out of the village and down the road to Konoha like they probably should have been doing, they went to the rooms that the fattest merchant had rented and had a look around. The little guy, who was the best artist he had ever seen, didn't have to forge too many papers. The artist had his finger in several pies, a few of which were illegal, and hadn't bothered trying to hide the evidence of his dirty dealings all that much, confident that since nobody had gone looking for it before now, they wouldn't go looking in the future. Now, to find a way to get the good townspeople of Saida to find all this wonderful evidence before the merchant left. Yamanaka and Noichi sighed as he filled out the paperwork that was sitting on his desk, well he waited for, but didn't particularly anticipate what was to come in a few short hours because, at some point today or perhaps early tomorrow, he would be dealing with Naruto, which was never fun. Dealing with Naruto was like a high-wire act at the best of times, and right now wasn't the best of times since, by all accounts, Naruto had been on a mission that would give even season Jounin issues. When he'd first encountered the boy earlier this year after that debacle in Kiri, the child had had the most precarious mental balance of anyone he'd encountered who wasn't stark raving mad. Since then, he'd been working on carefully integrating the darker parts of the boy's psyche before they jumped out of hiding and took him over in the middle of a mission or something. If Naruto had gotten to him any later than he had, it was entirely possible that all of those things that the boy had been trying to repress would have broken off and formed an entirely new personality. As it was, it had been a close thing, and integrating the repressed memories and emotions without driving the boy over the edge of madness was long, hard, and delicate work. This last mission could have undone a great deal of the progress he'd made with the boy over the last several months. The fact that he constantly had to watch over his shoulder because the Kyuubi was capable of appearing in the boy's mindscape didn't help matters at all. After he dealt with Naruto today, he would be dealing with the boy's teammates, Uchiha Sasuke, the boy Ino had a crush on, and Haruno Sakura, Ino's little friend whom she'd been feuding with over said crush for the last year or so. He wasn't looking forward to seeing them either. Especially since he'd be mentally exhausted from dealing with Naruto when he did and, by all accounts, both of them had serious issues that needed to be worked through, issues that had not been helped by the mission they hadn't been ready for, but had been forced to undertake nonetheless. Today was most definitely not going to be a good day. And, if Team Tetsuo didn't return by this evening, tomorrow wouldn't be either. So, are we going to ambush them? Kisame asked from where he was hidden in a tree, watching the trail that led to Konoha. No Kisame. Itachi replied, carefully studying the group that was traveling along the path he and his teammate were hidden alongside. Sasuke looked to be in bad shape based on the way he was leaning in close to Kakashi-senpai for comfort, the way a number of his teammates had after a difficult mission, but he didn't look to be broken yet. At this point, the motivation he had been considering giving his little brother if he thought he needed it would break him rather than build him back up, which was something neither of them needed. Based on the tensing of Kakashi-senpai's and the other Jounin's shoulders and the way Naruto was sniffing the air like a dog or some other wild animal, they could sense that someone was there and it was making them nervous. Seeing as his presence could be detrimental at the moment and nothing would be gained from a fight, he decided that it was time to leave. The time he had spent heading out to rescue Sasuke, who had proven not to need a rescue since his team had it handled, hadn't entirely been wasted though. By seeing Sasuke and his teammates, he had gotten a reminder of exactly what he was fighting for. He was fighting for his brother, who should have been seeking comfort in his presence rather than Kakashi-senpai's. He was fighting for little Naruto, who had grown up to become a warrior, and he was fighting for all of his other comrades, like the pink-haired girl and the other Jounin, and most of all, he was fighting for the villagers of Konoha, which was a ways up the road. Let's go Kisame. He said to his partner who looked to be gearing up for a fight. A fight that he'd be forced to interfere with and win for his brother's sake if it came down to it. So, what was that about? Kisame asked as he followed his partner, who he had begun to think of as a friend, away from what looked like it would have been a fun fight, giving him one chance to tell him the truth or their quasi-friendship was over. He hated it when people lied to him, and it looked as if that had been what Itachi had done. On the way through Fire Country, when they'd stopped to eat, he had heard some rather interesting rumors. Rumors of a fight that turned into a massacre that had supposedly involved Uchiha. Uchiha who wasn't Itachi, despite the fact that Itachi had supposedly slaughtered his entire clan. He had joined the Akatsuki to get away from the lies and help create the world without lies that Madara had envisioned. He wouldn't have a partner who lied to him while he was here. It would seem that my little brother didn't need my help after all. Itachi replied in that flat, emotionless tone of voice that gave him the creeps. Excuse me, he said, wondering if he heard the teenager right, but, your little what? My younger brother Sasuke. Itachi replied tonelessly as if he were discussing the price of dango and tea country, not the fact that the Uchiha clan wasn't as extinct as he'd been led to believe and that Itachi had left at least a little brother behind. "I thought you killed your entire clan aside from Madara," he said, wondering why he hadn't heard of this Asu kid before, especially considering how closely related to Itachi he was. "Are there any other Uchiha running around that I should know about?" Considering clan policy on bastards, I think it would be safe to say that the answer is no. Itachi replied as he made his way in the direction of the job they had been heading towards when Itachi had gone running back to Fire Country, apparently out of concern for his little brother, whom he'd spared when he'd slaughtered the rest of the clan, including his own parents for some strange reason. He would be having a long talk with his partner. They had all the time they needed since Itachi had more than doubled their journey to Kumo and there was nothing else for them to do on the way. Beside a town headman Akari Denmaru scowled as he sorted through the papers that had been found in the merchant's rooms by the innkeeper who had brought the man's exceedingly spoiled children back to his rooms because they had been causing mischief. Amongst the man's contacts was the name of an infamous slave trader who was wanted in at least 7 countries, and amongst the contracts the man had filed away was a tentative agreement for a possible B-rank mission to rescue the man's 2 brats that had been dated the morning after the kidnapping, which had been signed by one of the Konoha ninja who had been acting as a representative of Konoha. It had been as the ninja who had brought the man's children home had said. The merchant had used them all to stiff the ninja, not caring about the potential consequences to the town should the ninja choose to object to the treatment they had received. Based on the stories that were coming out of the southern part of Hotwater Country, the ninja could have killed them all without even breaking a sweat had they so chosen. Instead, they had risked their lives to rescue the merchant's children. And, how did the man repay them? With cruelty and rocks. Most shamefully of all, they had helped him. They would have to be more careful who they let into their town in the future. It was bad enough that several of their children had died because a criminal organization had decided to kidnap a bunch of genin and a wealthy merchant's children for ransom. Having said merchant exploit the deaths of their children in order to stiff the ninja who had rescued his children as well as their genin was worse, much, much worse. The next time they held this festival, they would be more careful when they vetted the merchants they invited, since inviting the wealthiest merchants they could think of hadn't worked out so well. The super wealthy merchant that they had thought would bring in a great deal of money and bankroll future festivals had turned out to be thieving, slaving criminal scum. Coming to a decision, he wrote a letter and handed it to his fastest runner to carry to the capital. Until the man returned with the Fire Lord's decision, the merchant would be held in the village on charges of theft, public disturbance, and inciting a riot, and his new quarters would be nowhere near as nice as this inn was. Gyutoro Kinmaru smirked as he saw the mob heading towards him. The stupid backcountry bastards who had failed to deal with the ninja as he'd hoped may think they had the upper hand now, but, in the end, it would be them who would be paying, and paying dearly. He may not have been Seigeto for instance, but he had more thugs in his employ than this town had residents, and could hire as many as he wanted to with all of the money he had. These people would regret turning on him. If they'd done what they were supposed to and followed his lead, he would have just bought up their town. Now however, now he was going to have to make an example of them, an example that would make people too afraid to oppose him, as word of what he was going to do here spread. "If you run me out of town, I'll just come back and you won't want me to come back. There won't be a town left when I do," he said confidently. "Run you out?" the man at the head of the mob said incredulously. "Why would we do something like that when we're here to arrest you?" His smirk slipped slightly. This wasn't how these things went. It didn't matter though, his men would come to free him and the example he made of them would be that much worse. Renji smiled when the prognosis the doctor gave him was good. Mai would live. She would probably have a bit of a limp for the rest of her life, but she would live. He wouldn't have been able to live without his wife had she died. He and Mai had lived near each other all their lives, played together every day as children, and had gone to the academy together in those infamous days before Zabuza had forced reform by killing his entire graduating class to prove he had what it took to be a ninja. It had been Mai who had saved his life during their graduation exam. Until Mai recovered, they would be staying here in Yugakure. The hot springs that surrounded the village could only help with Mai's recovery, and this would be his and Mai's chance to take the honeymoon they'd never gotten because they had been too busy working and then they'd been on the run after Zabuza had failed to kill the Mizukage who was being controlled by somebody who remained hidden in the shadows. Of course, the irony of the fact that a pair of missing nin were staying in a former ninja village wasn't lost on him. As soon as Mai was a bit better, this trip could prove to be a great deal of fun. Fortunately, Zabuza had left them with a little money, taking away that worry at least. As he smiled down at Mai, who was the love of his life and always had been, she opened her eyes and smiled back up at him despite the pain she was still in. They were near complete opposites, with her being bloodthirsty and he a near pacifist, but he loved her anyway and wouldn't trade her for the world. The Sandaime Hokage sat at his desk reading the report he'd received ahead of Team Tetsuo's arrival that morning. According to Kakashi, the genin had handled themselves rather professionally, despite the fact that they had been on a mission that was well above their pay grade, a mission that was more difficult than the Chunin exams generally were. He would of course await the results of the team's debriefing before he made a final decision, but he felt it safe to consider giving the team a couple of in-village D ranks to make up for the missions they were missing. He didn't expect Uchiha Sasuke and Haruno Sakura to become Chunin their first time out, but based on what he'd read, it looked like they would be able to handle the exams at the very least. Add in the fact that the two would be 2 months out of the academy at that point and Konoha's stock would go up. Hopefully, Inoichi's report would be favorable. If it wasn't, however, he would have to scrap his and the younger Shimura's plan, despite the boost it would have given Konoha's reputation. He wasn't willing to secure that rise in reputation at the expense of a pair of exceedingly promising young genin who looked to have stellar careers ahead of them. But ninja were exceedingly valuable, and great ones were worth far more than what could turn out to look like a cheap gimmick if the Haruno and the Uchiha didn't do as well as expected and brought the team down. There was a risk of that happening, considering what the Shimura boy had written of the Haruno girl who had finally started to make some gains in her abilities. "What are you thinking about, old friend?" Hamura asked as he and Kaharu entered his office uninvited, like they often did when they were bored and had nothing else to do. "January," he replied as he read the number of Uchiha Sasuke's confirmed kills. The boy wasn't on his brother's level, but ninja like Itachi showed up maybe once a generation at best. Sasuke, who had been named in honor of his father, showed a great deal of promise though. Given a bit of time and the right training, he could be one of Konoha's top shinobi. "You can't still be considering," Kaharu started, looking shocked that he would even think such a thing, especially considering what had just happened to the team in question. "Let's see how they handle their next few missions, and then we'll see," he replied as he read about Naruto's heretofore unknown talent with seals, which would have to be carefully evaluated and directed by a proper teacher, such as Jiraiya, who would be returning for the boy in several months. "So, what did you come in here for this time?" he asked as he continued to read, noting that the team had passed up on a potential recruit with no actual ties to Kurigakure that the medical corps would have been drooling over if the account he was reading was accurate. "Well, Hamura started. You were bored." He finished, knowing that that was the case, since his teammates had popped by to bother him when they couldn't think of anything else to do more times than he could count over the years. Kaharu and Hamura both had the decency to look vaguely guilty. Most people wouldn't have seen it, but he had known them since they were small children and knew the meaning of every slight shift in their posture, much the way he did with Danzo, whom he had known since he was a toddler. "I do believe that there were a few more D ranks than genin teams ready to take them today, thanks to the retraining program," he said with a smile, before deciding to play matchmaker for Hamura, since the widow Tanaka, whom Hamura had had a crush on back when they were children, had asked for a team to go to the market and fetch her some groceries. Yamanaka Inoichi frowned as he wrote up the reports on Shimura Tetsuo's students for the Hokage. In his opinion, the team, as it was, would most definitely not be prepared for the Chunin exams in January, despite the fact that the Hokage wanted them to be. He wasn't sure that he'd recommend them for the exams that were coming up in July next year either. Things could be considered to be very bad when the Jinchuriki was the most well-adjusted of the three. One reason for this had been because Morishita Kanako, who had been falling into addiction since the deaths of 2 of her students, had taken it upon herself to provide Naruto with some extra counseling alongside what he was providing the boy, so Naruto would never again flip out the way he had in Kiri. Another reason for this had been because Uchiha Sasuke was an emotional wreck who had been excused from his visits to the academy counselor by one assistant instructor Mizuki, who had supposedly been providing the boy with individualized jutsu instruction that could only take place during the time period that had been allotted by Sasuke's counselor more than 2 years ago, and any real progress that had been made had been lost since then. Yet another reason for this was that Sakura, who had seemed so normal on the surface, had created an alternate personality to think and voice any socially inappropriate thoughts for her, so she could remain polite, demure, and ladylike, as his mother constantly urged her to be. He felt sorry for Sakura's father. The few times he'd met the man, his impression of him had been henpecked. It was obvious to him and the rest of the village that Haruno Kita's main failing was that he was too weak-willed to stand up to his wife. As a result of his failure to keep his wife in check, his life had nearly been completely destroyed. The man had lost a job that he had held for 15 years, had only found another one through sheer dumb luck, and he might end up losing that one as well if the story of the true extent of the damage his wife had caused to his daughter was ever made known. He felt even sorrier for Sakura. The poor girl had been torn between 2 worlds for years and, to make matters worse, she'd recently had her illusions about one of them stripped away from her. Learning that the ninja world was nowhere near as romantic as she'd been led to believe had been very traumatic for the girl, and he was afraid that if things weren't taken into hand soon, a third personality might break off, causing incalculable damage to the girl's psyche. Uchiha Sasuke, on whom his daughter had unfortunately had a crush for years, was on the verge of a total breakdown. All it would take would be a push in the right spot and the kid would snap like dry kindling and, considering the boy's usual attitude which pushes everyone away, nobody would notice until it was far too late. Fortunately, based on the boy's reaction to his last mission, it didn't look like he would go on a killing spree like his brother had when he broke. Unfortunately, however, it looked like he'd be likely to commit suicide, most probably suicide by brother. The boy had spent almost every day of the last 4 years training himself to kill his brother to the exclusion of all else. Based on his scores though, he was nowhere near Uchiha Itachi's projected level of skill. All in all, the only member of the team who was even close to being mentally prepared for the Chunin exams and life as a Chunin afterward at this point was Naruto, who hadn't regressed nearly as much as he had feared he would. One thing he would never recommend doing with the boy, however, was placing him in Anbu. Taking on missions like the one he had just run on a semi-regular basis would be very bad for the boy's mental health. Sakura had been on her way home from the session she'd had with Ino's father when she had a rather strange encounter. Hyuga Hinata, whom she hadn't spoken more than 10 words to at the academy, had invited her to stay at her home. Wondering why the painfully shy girl had invited her to a sleepover considering the fact that they had never really been friends, she had asked her as much. Much to her surprise, the girl subsequently informed her that she hadn't invited her for a sleepover, she had invited her to stay. Smiling at the strange girl so as not to upset her, she told her she would consider her generous offer and got the heck out of there as quickly as she could. She didn't know what was wrong with Hinata and she didn't want to know. That had turned out to be the first of a number of strange encounters she ended up having on the way home. The next one had occurred as she was making her way through the marketplace, having decided to stop to get some anmitsu on the way home in order to calm her nerves after the rather bizarre encounter with Hinata. While she was at the stand that sold some of the best anmitsu in Konoha, an old woman, whom she'd never seen before, had walked up to her. Critically looked her up and down and pulled the front of her dress forward at the waist. "Too skinny," the woman had said with a scowl before walking off. On the way home from the market, she had been stopped by a number of ninja who had asked her if she was okay, further disturbing her, as all of the ninja who had stopped her had been strangers. 2 more of her former classmates, these 2 being rivals for Sasuke's affection and girls who had cruelly teased her for years, had stopped her and offered to let her stay at their homes as well. The weird thing about it was that they actually seemed to be sincere in their offers. By the time she got home, she was almost afraid of what she might, or worse, might not find when she went inside. Fortunately, things weren't as bad as she feared they would be, and, much to her relief, her mother was there to greet her at the door. She had been relieved to see her mother for all of the 5 minutes it had taken for her day to go completely to hell. It would seem that her mother hadn't dropped out of her extreme mode in the 3 weeks that she'd been gone, and that the woman had said or done something that had caused the entire village to be concerned for her welfare. Considering the fact that her mother soon started acting like she'd completely lost it, she could see why even people who had previously disliked her were inviting her to live with them. She had barely gotten in the door before her crying mother, who'd been both shocked and happy to see her, had started sobbing over the loss of her pretty hair, the nicks, blisters and calluses on her hands, the scraped knee, and the scratches on her arms and legs. After crying for a good 15 minutes, her mother had ordered her to put her shoes back on. Confused, she complied only to be herded her down to the local civilian clinic that she'd been going to since she was a baby. At the clinic, she became beyond mortified as her mother embarrassed her in front of everyone in the waiting room by loudly demanding the doctor come out immediately and give her a full examination and check for sexual abuse. To her utter humiliation, she was forced to sit in the waiting room for an hour and a half until one of the doctors had time to see a walk-in because she knew that if she ran, her mother would just kick up a fuss until she cooperated. As she sat there in the toy-filled waiting room of the pediatric clinic, she could feel the eyes of all of the other patients and their parents, some of whom were neighbors whom she had known since she was a baby, on her. Eventually, one of the 3 doctors who ran the clinic had a free slot due to a cancellation, and her mother followed her into the examination room where the doctor had asked her a number of awkward questions that she didn't want to be asked, much less answer in front of her mother. To make matters worse, her mother ended up creating a commotion when she'd refused to strip in order to be fully examined by the doctor. She didn't need to be looked at there. Contrary to what her mother seemed to think, none of her teammates had even considered using her in that manner. She told her mother as much before she stormed off, fully aware of the eyes that were following her as she left the building. Hinata's invitation was starting to look better and better by the minute. Baruno Kita was tense as he headed home. The first hint he'd been given that his wife had broken her promise to stop embarrassing the family by making baseless accusations in an attempt to drive Sakura-sensei's family out of town, the way she'd driven that foreign family out a couple years back, had been when his new boss had come up to him, told him that he didn't blame him, and that he still had a job since he was a good worker, and what was going on wasn't really his fault. His wife's current attempts at trying to drive another family out of Konoha hadn't gone so well for their own family. Sakura-sensei was related to a scary and powerful man who could crush his family like a bug if he so chose, and everyone knew it. Because everyone knew it, they did their best to avoid supporting them, lest they find themselves guilty of challenging Danzo by association. Add the fact that many ninja were upset that they hadn't been taking care of their daughter correctly, and their family, he and his wife at least, were pretty much persona non grata in Konoha. On the way home, he had received a number of looks of pity and/or concern that confirmed the fact that his wife had been unable to keep her promise for even a week. To add to his confusion, the old doctor he'd known since he was a child and had been bringing his daughter to, had walked up to him and asked him to schedule an appointment for his daughter since the girl had walked out on an examination when he'd run into him while he was on his way home from the clinic. As it had been for the last few weeks, the whispers that had steadily begun to turn harsh continued to follow him as he passed. "Dear," he said as soon as he got into the door to find his red-eyed wife, who'd obviously been crying earlier waiting for him. "I thought that you had promised to quit trying to antagonize the Shimura family." "I did." His wife wailed, "But you didn't see Sakura when she returned. It was obvious that they were mistreating her and they made her too afraid to say anything other than what they wanted her to say. You should have seen her. She ran out of the clinic in fear." "Where is she now?" he asked, concerned about his daughter and praying that things weren't anywhere near as bad as his wife had been portraying them. "I don't know. She left a note saying that she was moving out." His wife wailed. Sakura sighed as she made her way to the first place on the short list she had made the day she'd passed the graduation exam, when she'd been flush with excitement over her newfound state of adulthood and considered taking it one step further. She'd almost thrown the list out the next day when she'd realized how expensive the prospect was and that she wouldn't have anyone there to fix her meals for her, to tuck her in at night, and to tend to her when she was sad, lonely, or ill. Now, despite the fact that she had a feeling that she was being a bit rash, she was a bit glad she hadn't thrown the list out. If Naruto and Sasuke could live on their own without any parents telling them what to do or, worse, completely embarrassing them in front of the entire village, then she could too. She'd miss her mom's cooking and seeing her dad at dinner and sometimes breakfast, but that was a natural consequence of living on her own. Normally, her mother wasn't anywhere near as bad as this, and she was a good mother who had made sure she had everything she needed, comforted her when she was down, and had dinner on the table for if she wanted it. But lately, her mother had gone into extreme mode. Her mother rarely if ever went into extreme mode unless someone either very seriously upset her like that one woman who had constantly been bitchy towards her and eventually knocked her into the mud in the marketplace had been, or unless something that was precious to her was threatened in some way. When her mother was in extreme mode, you'd better hope you weren't her target because she would do anything it took to destroy you. She pulled herself out of her musing and focused on the large building in front of her that had once been a roadside inn back before the founding of Konoha, which provided reputable genin housing from what she'd heard. From the outside, it looked to be reasonably well kept for a centuries-old building that had been inhabited almost solely by teenagers and young adults who'd been specially trained to destroy things for the last 50 years. There were a number of older teenagers hanging around on the porch and it was quite obvious that they were ninja despite the fact that they were dressed in off-duty attire. They were too alert and there were far too many weapons evident for them to be anything else. After passing the rather intimidating group that was hanging out on the porch, who'd stared at her the entire time, she almost timidly made her way to the main office, cowed by the stares and the whispers which had followed her along the way. Apparently, word of her mother's behavior at the clinic had already gotten around. She ended up leaving the office and the building altogether 5 minutes later after the manager of the building that was more like a boarding house than an apartment complex had apologetically informed her that there were no openings and that the waitlist was a year long. After that, she started making her way down the list of places that had rooms and apartments for rent at rates which appeared to be reasonable for someone living on a genin income. As she did so, it quickly became apparent why most of those places were so reasonably priced. The cats that belonged to the old woman on Life Street were absolutely vicious, and living in the same building as them would be taking her life into her own hands. Other people who were renting out rooms in their homes expected her to do the equivalent of several D-ranked missions for free while she lived there, and the apartment complexes turned out to be located in the parts of town where it was recommended that you have several weapons on hand before approaching. Finally, as darkness fell, when she was about to give up hope, she made her way to the last building on the list. The building was a bit old and run down, but it wasn't too bad, and the neighborhood it was in wasn't in the worst part of town either. Honestly, after the other places she'd seen, she was confused and somewhat wary as to why the rent there was so low. Despite the late hour, the manager, who seemed to be a nice enough person, had shown her around a reasonably sized if somewhat elderly apartment that she could actually see herself living in. Almost afraid that there had been a misprint in the advertisement that had caused her to put the place on the list, she had asked the manager what the rent was. The advertisement had been completely accurate. Half fearing that she'd find asbestos in the walls or something, she signed the lease despite the fact that her instincts were telling her that the manager was trying to hide something from her. So far, aside from home, which she would need to move away from one day anyway, this place had been the best option available. After entering her new apartment to set down the bag of belongings she'd hurriedly packed before leaving, she turned around to head to her former home in order to pick up the rest of her stuff. On the way out of the building, she had almost run into Naruto who had been coming up the stairs. "Hey Sakura, what are you doing here?" Naruto asked. "I live here." She replied, wondering what Naruto was doing here and if he'd been stalking her for some reason. "That's funny, so do I," Naruto said. Kita perked up slightly when he'd heard the front door open. He had been waiting all evening for his daughter to return and half fearing that she wouldn't since there were any number of places she could have gone to stay until she found a new place to live. The fact that she'd come home instead seemed to be a good sign. "I'd add, I've missed you," Sakura said as she gave him a hug when he went to the door to greet her. He quietly studied his daughter, searching for signs of the horrendous abuse she'd supposedly gone through and the terror that his wife had spoke of. She didn't look any more badly banged up than a number of his ninja acquaintances had after intense training, and she didn't look particularly fearful or as if she were trying to hide anything from him. A few of the scratches he saw on her arms and legs reminded him of how a childhood friend of his who'd gone through the academy had looked after he'd learned how to jump through trees, but before he'd learned how to avoid twigs and small branches. About the most shocking change to her appearance was the fact that her hair had been cut short, but many kunoichi did that after academy graduation when they got into the field where long hair would get snagged on branches and such unless it was properly pinned back. They usually ended up growing it back later if at all. "I've missed you too, sweetheart," he said when he finished looking his daughter over and finding much to his relief that it appeared that his wife had been exaggerating. "What's this I hear about you moving out?" he asked his daughter. "I'm sorry," Sakura said sadly. "Mom completely humiliated me at the clinic and in front of the doctor and I ran off to go look for an apartment so I wouldn't have to deal with her. I have to move now since I already signed the lease." "You don't seem to be all that happy about moving," he said, knowing that Sakura's sudden decision had become problematic. He couldn't get his child out of the lease agreement because she was an adult under Konoha law and, because of that, Sakura would have to pay for the apartment for however long the lease was for, even if she didn't move in. "I don't want to leave you and Mom behind, no matter how annoying she's being right now, and Naruto lives in the building," Sakura replied. Oh dear. Barako hadn't entirely been imagining things. Considering the fact that Sakura actually seemed to be afraid to live in the same building as Naruto, it was clear that something had really happened while his daughter was away. "Why don't you want to live in the same building as your teammate, dear?" he asked carefully, watching her to see if she would try to hide anything from him, afraid of what the demon in a child's skin could have done to his daughter while she had gone somewhere where he couldn't keep her safe. "He was nice to me during the trip and all, but I know for a fact that he's dangerous," Sakura replied. "What makes you think he's dangerous?" he asked, almost afraid to learn that his wife may have broken a law that she shouldn't have. "I tried to hit him once and he threatened to break my arm," Sakura said. "When Mom took me to file a complaint against him, the guy at the complaints desk told me about how he had ripped apart a genin team from Iowa with his bare hands." He felt slightly faint as he tried to process his daughter's statement and exactly what his daughter had gotten into in becoming a ninja. He'd known that ninja were different, but that statement clearly illustrated the difference. A normal, law-abiding civilian from Konoha at least would have found the ideas of killings such as that horrific. For shinobi, such killing was apparently considered admirable, considering how opinion of the demon had shifted amongst the shinobi ranks in recent times. "At least they were from Iowa," he finally said as he vaguely patted his daughter on the head before going to sit down, feeling slightly faint as he fully realized that his daughter's life would now be following a blood-soaked path. Amik. Sakura's first try parents meet Sakura's and I'm parents. "An accountant, huh?" Haruno Kizashi said as he studied the other man whose hair had been slicked down and back rather than combed up in his famous cherry blossom design. "You try being babysat by Danzo when you're a little kid and see if you still want to be a ninja afterward," Haruno Kita replied. "Yeah, I could see how that could happen. Danzo's given me the creeps since day one," Kizashi replied. "Our Danzo eats people," Kita said in a manner that almost seemed as if he was trying to one-up him. "Really?" Kizashi asked, slightly disturbed by the turn the conversation had taken. Despite the fact that he looked normal on the surface, there was obviously something wrong with his more. Kizashi studied the man who was mentally disturbed on some level at the very least, the more inclined he was to believe that the man was more a sibling or a cousin than a straight counterpart. He'd run into a number of Harunos who had fathered children identical in name and appearance to his daughter, who'd had different ancestors than he did on his and his wife's brief tour of the multiverse. Amazingly, just as often as there were worlds where he had married his dear Miyuki and they had Sakura, there were worlds where their Sakura was born to people who had nothing in common with them, aside from the Haruno family name and a few common ancestors in the distant past. One of the more memorable Haruno couples that particularly stood out in his mind had been the fellow who had looked a great deal like a white-haired cat turned human, who had been married to what he could have sworn was an Uzumaki. "And you are?" Haruno Miyuki asked the woman who was standing next to Haruno Kita, though it was clear that she recognized her. "Haruno Barako." Kita's wife replied, putting a special emphasis on the Haruno, clearly recognizing the other woman as well. Apparently, this was yet another universe where Barako and Miyuki both existed and were both rivals. There had been any number of universes where one or the other hadn't existed, just as there had been any number of universes where Sakura's mother had been named Barako, but hadn't been that Barako. Meeting the pink-haired half-Uzumaki Barako who had been born in that Barako's stead had been quite the experience, especially since it had been his counterpart who'd been the blonde instead of his wife's. "Nice to meet you." Miyuki replied in a falsely sweet tone. "Likewise." Barako replied in a tone that was just as saccharine. The rest of the visit was somewhat tense thanks to Barako and Miyuki's somewhat catty behavior. Based on the look that poor disturbed Kita fellow was giving Miyuki, the man seemed to have regretted marrying Barako instead. He knew that he would have regretted marrying Barako if he'd married her himself. The woman was a shrew, and poor Mr. Takeda down the street was the most henpecked man he knew. How a woman like that could create a child that bore any resemblance to his precious Sakura, he didn't know. "I can't believe that there's a world where you married her," Miyuki said to her husband when they returned to their own world where their Sakura was waiting. "That poor Kita fellow isn't exactly me dear, so it's safe to say that there isn't a world where I married that woman," Kizashi replied. The Hokage sighed as he read Inoichi's report. It would seem that his plans regarding the Chunin exams would have to be scrapped. That left one minor issue though, and that was the missions that had been assigned to Team Tetsuo in preparation for the exams. Because they'd been pulled off the regular schedule, they had been forced to scrabble to find last-minute replacements for the two missions that the team had been forced to cancel in order to return to Konoha, and there were issues with the remaining ones, such as the fact that he would have to completely rework the entire border patrol schedule if the team didn't take that one. Despite the fact that Shimura Tetsuo's students wouldn't be attending the Chunin exams in Suna, it would appear that they would still have to complete the missions that had been assigned to them in preparation for those exams, as the alternative would end up being a nightmare of paperwork for him, as he was forced to stamp the forms rescinding the missions and refile them in the general mission pool, which meant running through that paperwork again as well. Due to the young Genin's mental states, he'd almost been tempted to go that route. The reason he hadn't done so though was because of the fact that the retraining of the recent Genin and Academy failures and the revamping of the Academy curriculum had generated a great deal of work that he was already way behind on. As he signed the forms that would send Team Tetsuo to their fate, whatever it may be, he hoped that he wasn't making a mistake sending them back out there so soon after such an incredibly traumatic mission, especially considering the number of things that could go wrong during even a routine caravan escort, border patrol, or bandit clearing mission. On the other hand however, despite the number of things that could go wrong on those 3 basic C-rank missions, they were usually uneventful, which was why it had long ago been deemed safe enough to send Genin on them, so long as there was a Jounin to supervise things and make sure the kids weren't slacking off. Team Tetsuo had 2 Jounin at this point, though Kakashi would be departing at the end of December when the final mission he'd signed up to take in conjunction with the team ended. Both Sasuke and Sakura were in serious need of counseling, the sooner the better, but a few easy and routine C ranks that had better chances of them dying of boredom than anything else shouldn't break them before they received said counseling. Considering the fact that the team had just had a mission go south on them in a way that was pretty much 1 in a million, the odds against something like that happening again anytime soon were good. So, while he was afraid of what could go wrong, odds were that not much would go wrong and Team Tetsuo would come home safe. Naruto sighed when he received the summons from the council. The Hokage's Council of Advisors wasn't exactly a governmental body, but they held a great deal of authority and power in the village, and not showing up when summoned by them was asking for trouble, especially since the old man usually sided with their decisions. Of the 3, the one he had heard the most about and had run into most often was Shimura Danzo, who was Tetsuo-sensei's grandfather. The two of them had something of an antagonistic relationship and would often hurl thinly veiled barbs at each other every time they encountered each other. The meeting with the council, in which he, Sasuke, and Sakura had been present, had been tedious and annoying, and he had been exceedingly relieved when they had finally been released. They still had to pack for the missions they'd found out only hours earlier were back on after all, and the meeting had cut sharply into his prep time, especially since he'd unpacked his entire apartment last night and would be forced to pack it again since Suzume and Kurosaki were out of the village, which meant that he'd have to ask Satoshi to watch his plants again. Hopefully Sakura, who had moved into his building that morning while her timid father had attempted to lecture him on something or other, had learned her lesson this time. If she hadn't, he wasn't loaning her any more clothes. "Don't, Sasuke, just don't," Naruto said when he saw the look in his teammates' eyes as they exited the meeting with the council, which had had something to do with his, Sasuke's and Sakura's mental evaluations. Throughout the meeting, the old man's friends had asked a bunch of inane questions that covered the same ground over and over, either intent on getting the right answer so they could pressure the Hokage into changing his decision in regards to the exams, or intent on tripping them up and finding a reason to agree with the Hokage that sending them to Suna was a bad idea. They'd eventually found the reason that proved to them that the Hokage's decision had been justified in this instance, and, because of that, the team would be forced to wait until July at the very least before they could take the Chunin exams. Why not? They're just a bunch of old. Sasuke started, apparently having been looking forward to going to Suna so he could test his skills against those of ninja from other countries. "Don't finish that," he said, hurriedly cutting Sasuke off when he'd seen the look that Danzo had given his teammate. Tetsuo-sensei had once explained to him exactly how dangerous the council were, especially Danzo, and he'd taken the lesson to heart. One didn't survive 60 years in a field where the average life expectancy was 10, maybe 15 years of service at best by being incompetent. The reason that the old man was Hokage instead of his former teammates or Danzo was because he was just that much more awesome than his advisors. The fact that the Yondaime had been even more powerful than the old man just went to show just how incredibly awesome the Yondaime had been and why everyone who wasn't from Konoha had rightly feared him. Sasuke gave him that look, which was a habit that Tetsuo-sensei and Kakashi had tried in vain to break him of. There was only one thing for it. He would have to let Sasuke learn the hard way, which meant pitting Sasuke up against one of the old farts so he could see exactly where he stood in comparison. He was almost tempted to see how Sasuke would fare against Danzo, but he didn't want to see what would happen to his teammate if he needlessly antagonized the old man during their fight. Unlike Koharu and Homura, Danzo could and would disappear you like you'd never even existed. With that in mind, he instead chose someone who was just about as tough as the old man and slightly more forgiving. "Udatain-sama," he called out, causing the counselors to pause in their tracks, probably shocked by how respectful he was being, since he still called the Hokage old man. "Uchiha Sasuke would like to respectfully request a spar in order to gain some of the wisdom you have earned through your valuable experience." "Request granted," Koharu replied with a slightly sadistic smile that scared the hell out of him after a brief conversation with her fellow council members. Based on the slight and rather arrogant smirk Sasuke gave after he'd gotten over his surprise at being volunteered for a spar with one of the council members, the boy wasn't going to be taking this seriously. More's the pity for him. He was getting along better with the other boy, but that didn't mean that Sasuke didn't grate on his nerves and bug the hell out of him. And, seeing him learn the sort of lesson that Koharu was about to teach. The spar looked just as painful as he expected a spar between a rookie genin and a war veteran who had fought on the front lines and came back with all of their limbs intact would be. Koharu had been on the front lines during the first two Shinobi World Wars and lived to tell the tale, so naturally, despite the fact that age and inactivity were catching up to her, she was beyond tough. Sasuke had opened with his usual stance that was a cross between the standard academy form and something else that had probably been taught to him back when his clan was still alive. Koharu took a stance that he didn't recognize, which had very few if any holes in it, with any hole he may spot more likely being a trap than an actual hole in her defense. Both of them stood waiting for the other to make the first move until Sasuke finally lost his patience and opened with a high kick, which was promptly blocked before Sasuke was swiftly and brutally smacked down. Koharu, despite the fact that age had put some weight on her, still kept herself in something approaching fighting shape. This was to be expected considering the fact that one of her side hobbies was training her grandchildren. Sasuke apparently hadn't learned his lesson, or the one Tetsuo-sensei had tried to teach him about not letting anger get the best of him, as he sprung up and flew at Koharu in a rage. This was the wrong move to make and only resulted in Sasuke getting smacked down again and again without even once landing a blow on the council member until Koharu had called an end to the spar and thanked Sasuke for the light workout. As he watched Sasuke watch the female member of Team Tobirama leave, Naruto kenned that the furious glint in Sasuke's eyes as he watched the council member depart meant trouble. There's a reason that the consilmemers still hold the rank of Jounin, and it doesn't have anything to do with any honorary bullshit either. He said to his teammate who looked to be about to blame him for his humiliating defeat. The reason none of them are Hokage is because the old man still has the hat. Any one of them could give Uchiha Itachi a tough time if they didn't outright kill him if he ever chose to go against them. Sasuke turned and gave him a sharp and surprised look at that last statement. Mentioning Itachi was always a surefire way to get the boy's attention. He'd been sure to do it sparingly though, in order to not desensitize the boy to the mentioning of his brother's name. What did you expect would happen? He asked with a shrug as he walked away from his defeated teammate, who probably wouldn't absorb the lesson that Kaharu had taken the trouble and time out of her busy day to teach. The old man and his counselors have been ninja for over 60 years. They've forgotten more things about being a shinobi than most ninja learn during a lifetime. Sakura sighed as she packed her bag according to academy guidelines, this time being sure to leave out any cosmetics or other frills that would just add unneeded weight. She didn't want a repeat of the incident at the beginning of her genin career 3 weeks ago. Even though she knew that being a shinobi would be far tougher than her romantic dreams had led her to believe, she still liked to have at least some creature comforts, and she wouldn't be able to have any of those comforts if she couldn't carry them with her. As she packed, the silence of her new apartment unsettled her. She wondered how Naruto was able to stand it. She hadn't spent more than an hour in her new apartment and she was already going up the wall. She was so used to the distant sounds of her mother puttering about downstairs that not hearing them disturbed her. A decided lack of sounds from her nearest neighbors and the people who wandered through the outside street in the much busier district in which her former home was located, which disturbed her as well. The silence seemed to be creeping in from every corner and pressing down on her. She had made her decision though, and, as her father had pointed out the night before as he helped her pack her belongings, she would be forced to live with it. Her father had promised to visit as often as he could, but she knew that with work and all, that wouldn't be all that often, which meant that she would be left her alone in the silence for long stretches of time. Fortunately for her sanity at the moment, she would be getting out of here soon and would be spending time in company for a few weeks. She wasn't too sure what she felt about the people she'd be spending the next few weeks with, but at least she wouldn't be left alone in silence. Her mother, whom she was still very mad at, had been rather upset to discover that she was leaving again so soon. Even though she wasn't all that happy about the fact that she was going to be leaving the village after she just got back herself, she at least understood that there was nothing she could do about it since the team had made a number of prior commitments that they couldn't break. She just hoped that her mother would snap out of her extreme mode soon. The way she was going to say something that pissed off the wrong person and there'd be a good chance that she wouldn't be there when she got back. The team was back on the road and quite unhappy with the pace that had been set in order to rendezvous with the caravan they were supposed to be escorting to Tanigakure in time. Had their trip not been cut short due to the snafu in Saida, they would have taken a far more leisurely pace in order to meet the caravan that was leaving from a trading town which was a bit to the southeast of Kusagakure and only just located inside fire country than the one they were currently taking in order to make sure they got there in time to help with the final checks prior to departure. The fact that Sasuke and Sakura were not yet accustomed to traveling through the treetop highway slowed them down considerably and added several days to their journey since they had to take established ground roads to get to their destination. After the team left the caravan in Tanigakure either on the last day of November or the 1st of December, they would have to run back to the border between fire and river for a week of patrol at one of the more isolated river country border crossings before they ran across river country and into wind country, where they would be employed on one of the regular winter sweeps for bandits along the wind country border. The mission in Wind Country had originally been arranged to give the team experience with working with foreign shinobi on a joint mission, but that was something they already had thanks to that screw-up in Saida that had led to them assisting the forces of the rogue ninja Mamachi Zabuza on a mission that was way above the genin's pay grade. As the team ran towards the small border trading town, there was a chill in the air that made it obvious that November would be coming to an end relatively soon and that winter was fast approaching. The bocce nervously tapped his pen against his desk as he tried to remember the answer to the question on the history test in front of him. He and his former classmates, as well as the 3 years above them, had until January when school let back in for the fall cycle. Students and all of the teachers would be occupied with the current academy students to cram in 6 years of study and learn all of the things they should have learned during their first run-through of the academy but hadn't for some reason. If they succeeded, all of them who had previously failed would have one more chance to become ninja, which meant that this was his last chance to make his father proud of him before he got stuck back in the civilian school that he'd been enrolled in after he'd failed his final teamwork test the last time. Ami, who had been pulled out of some all-girls school near the capital for this, looked almost as nervous as he felt. He felt an upsurge of satisfaction at this. He still hadn't forgiven her for what she did to him during the teamwork test in front of the Jounin, who could have been their sensei if they hadn't screwed up. Hopefully, his scores on his final test at the beginning of January would change what team he ended up on because, in his book, if he ever saw Ami again after this, it would be too soon. The history book that he was currently being tested out of had been quite a revelation, especially when he tried to read between the lines the way his father had taught him. Apparently, the story about the publisher of the old textbooks having been in the pay of a foreign village was true and the man had indeed bribed one of the Hokage's secretaries to forge the Hokage's approval for the editions he produced. That was the only explanation he could find for why the new textbooks were so wildly different from the old ones. The new textbooks that his father had told him looked very much like the textbooks that he'd learned out of when he was a kid. The old publisher had apparently hated the Uzumaki for some strange reason. Either that or the new publisher was in Uzumaki. In the old book, the Uzumaki name hadn't appeared once and Uzushi Agakure had never been mentioned. In just about every chapter of the new history book however, either in Uzumaki or Uzushi Agakure would be mentioned somewhere. The Shodai Hokage's wife. Uzumaki. Konoha's ally during the First Shinobi World War. Uzushi Agakure who sent a battalion of Uzumaki to reinforce the Nidame's forces. Konoha's ally for most of the Second War until it was overrun by Kumo, Kiri, and Iwa. You guessed it. It made you wonder why the adults hated Naruto so much considering how important his family had been and everything they'd done for Konoha. The teacher's announcement that they had 10 minutes violently pulled him out of his musing as he frantically turned to the test, deciding to skip that question and answer the next one. The answer to that one was of course, Uzumaki. Suzume felt like screaming. That was the second time she'd run into that white-haired pervert while she wasn't fully dressed. A month ago, when she and Yamanaka Eri, who was currently running border patrol near AIM, had decided to stop at an onsen on their way home from an escort mission, the white-haired bastard had completely ruined her bath. This time, she had been changing and had seen a glint in the distance. Figuring that it might be a poacher, she'd hopped into a nearby tree and pulled out her field glasses in order to investigate. What she saw when she looked through the binoculars was a certain white-haired pervert who was putting a telescope away and pulling out a notebook. If that white-haired pervert was who she thought he was rather than an imposter, there was a good chance that she would be appearing in the next book in the Icha Icha series, since she couldn't go over there and shove that damn notebook up the Sanin's ass, because he was just outside the borders of the nature preserve she was supposed to be patrolling. As soon as she wasn't stuck playing park ranger, she would be tracking that pervert down and giving him a piece of her mind with her fists, legendary Sanin or no. Konohamaru sighed as he made his way up to the small rooftop greenhouse, where the boss kept most of his plants. The boss's former teammate Satoshi had to go on a mission so he'd handed him the boss's keys and asked him to water his plants until either he or Naruto got back. He'd agreed to do so because he knew that Naruto would be sad if he found his plants dead when he returned sometime in late December. When Naruto had gotten back before he turned around and left again, he may as well has been gone, since he hadn't really had any time to spend with him when he'd returned for about 30 hours or so after being gone for 3 weeks. First, he'd had to spend a bunch of time being debriefed about a mission that had gone wrong, then he'd had to unpack his apartment. The next day, he'd had to meet with the council, repack his apartment, and leave again. It sucked while Naruto was away. Things had gotten boring rather quickly after he'd left since he didn't really have anyone to play with and nobody to teach him aside from boring old Abisu. Even having Naruto around when he was going through one of his bad days was better than not having him around. Without Naruto around, he hadn't really had any adventures. When Naruto was there was almost always something interesting going on, like back when they'd played veterinarian and snuck onto the Nara property to watch how baby deer were born, or the time they'd played ninja on the library roof and got jazzed off by an angry librarian. Naruto had taught him how to climb trees, set traps, and set bones. Not every lesson Naruto had taught him had been fun or even nice, but there was one thing the lessons never were, and that was boring. Zanbashi Mizuko sat in his favorite watering hole in Kiri, eagerly listening to the account that a merchant from Hot Water Country was relating to the entire bar. Apparently, Momochi Zabuza and a group of 10 ninja had gone into that country, raided the base of a criminal organization that had hired more than 100 missing men, and slaughtered every last one of them. The most amazing thing about the story was the fact that 4 of the 10 ninja who had accompanied the rogue swordsman had been children who were no older than 13. He had been inclined to disbelieve the story right up until the merchant had mentioned a description of one of the children who had participated that was based on the eyewitness account of one of the survivors of the massacre, one of the children who had been spared that night as all the adults had been slaughtered. According to the child, one of the ninja that had taken part in the killing had been a blonde boy who had lines on his cheeks. It would seem that Uzumaki Naruto had been getting around. Apparently, Konoha hadn't wanted any rogue wannabe ninja villages anywhere near their borders. Hiring Zabuza, whose reputation preceded him, in order to draw attention away from their involvement in the incident, had been a stroke of pure genius. Since nobody even seemed to realize that Konoha had been involved because Zabuza's name had gotten itself attached to the operation, Konoha would be able to keep their goody two-shoes reputation for a while longer. Naruto sneezed as he helped set up camp. He'd been doing that a lot lately, and if he had ever been sick a day of his life, he might have thought that he was coming down with a cold. Since he hadn't, he just figured that it was just one more of those weird and inexplicable things that tended to happen to him. Shrugging it off, he went back to gathering kindling for the fire. As he reached for a stick that he'd noticed lying near a log, he felt a sharp pain in his wrist. Looking down, he found that the reason his wrist was hurting was because a snake had buried its fangs in it. "Aw crap, not again." He yelled as the snake disengaged and rather swiftly started slithering away. The 2 puncture marks were completely healed by the time he started to feel nauseous. Fortunately, he managed to make it back to camp before he started puking his guts up. The cramps had already started setting in by the time anyone realized that something was wrong. Considering what had happened the last time he'd gotten bitten by one of those things, tonight was going to be hell. Naruto was rather embarrassed to find himself being carried for the 2 days following the snackabite. He could walk fine after the first day despite the fact that he'd still been feeling queasy, but Tetsuo-sensei tended to be slightly overprotective of him after he got into such situations as the snackabite and hadn't allowed him to do so. Fortunately for his reputation, Tetsuo-sensei had let him down before they had reached the small trading outpost from which the caravan they would be escorting would be departing. Since the place was little more than a watering hole for the animals who pulled the traders' carts that was surrounded by a few houses and a couple of shops that sold a few items that the merchants might have forgotten to bring with them and a small discreetly placed brothel, there had been little need to run around and explore and potentially risk another day of being carried. The night of the snackabite had been exceedingly miserable, and there had been several points during it that he'd wished that he would have died in under an hour like a normal person. He had been feverish and vomiting constantly for that entire night. By midnight that night, he had run out of things to puke up, even bile, and had dry heaved for the next several hours. But fortunately, by dawn the following morning, the fever had broke and the heaves began to subside. Throughout the following day, the fever, which had most likely been caused by the Kyuubi's chakra burning through his system in order to remove the poison, had subsided and the queasiness had slowly vanished until both were finally gone completely by sundown. Of course, that hadn't stopped Tetsuo-sensei from carrying him for the entire day after that until they'd reached the trading outpost. His situational awareness had improved greatly over the years, but it still wasn't perfect and he was almost willing to swear that that damn snake that had bit him and its ilk were invisible, their camouflage was so good. That, and he had a potentially lethal tendency to ignore breathing things that looked like they belonged, such as squirrels, mice, and lizards, when he was on the lookout for traps, which could be an exceedingly dangerous oversight considering the number of summons and other animals ninja often used. But if he treated every creature in the vicinity as a threat, he would end up becoming a paranoid wreck, which would make him worse than useless in the long run. Fortunately, thanks to the Kyuubi and his own dumb luck, he'd survived this incident like he had the others, and he was well enough to complete the mission and contribute to the protection of the caravan that he and his team would be traveling with when the time came. The caravan they would be escorting to Tanigakure was going to be made up of several much smaller caravans from several countries, including the Land of Iron and the Land of Tea, hence the somewhat isolated meeting place and the rather slow travel time, as it would take a while for the separate groups and whatever new employees they picked up in town to get into cinch and adapt to the new routine. Such caravans were ideal for new genin who were starting out, as the longer travel time got the young ninja accustomed to life on the road in such a setting, and the bandits who attacked caravans knew that the larger ones tended to be better guarded thanks to the training opportunities they provided. That didn't mean that such caravans were never attacked by bandits however, hence the hiring of ninjas for escort duty, as most bandits had at least a little ninja training that they'd picked up from somewhere, which tended to make them overconfident and occasionally lucky. The path that the caravan would be following was one that would navigate through the safer byways of the Fire Country borderlands, where 2 more merchants would be picked up in a pair of small towns, one of which was known for its textiles and the other of which was popular for its pottery, before the caravan took a sharp turn into river country and made its way into Tanigakure with its shipment of goods. Because most of this trip would be through Fire Country, it had made sense to the caravan leaders to hire Konoha ninja, despite the caravan's eventual destination. Naturally, this choice would create some friction when they arrived in Tani, but that couldn't be helped. All they could do about that however was do their best to stay out of trouble and get out of the village hidden in the valleys as quickly as possible after confirmation of mission completion was received. As the caravan prepared to get underway, Shimura Tetsuo looked as if he were waiting for the other shoe to drop. While it was possible that the snackabite had appeased whatever curse Naruto was apparently under, it was clear that he was almost certain that such a minor mishap wouldn't be enough of a disaster, even considering the fact that had that snake bitten someone else they would have most assuredly died. Wood vipers, though rare, were exceedingly deadly. For a while, nothing of note happened, and then one day Naruto ran into the elderly red-haired ox cart driver while wandering amongst the carts of the caravan. Whether or not this would be considered a good thing was up for debate. While on the one hand, Naruto had gotten to meet and learn from a relative, on the other, Naruto had met and learned from a relative. Back when the Uzumaki were still a force to be reckoned with, work hard, play harder. That have been the unofficial Uzumaki family motto. Perhaps, the only reason Uzumaki had stood as long as it had with the Uzumaki in residence had been the seals that the Uzumaki were famous for. Of course, those self-same seals had caused most of the continent to fear them enough that 3 of the 5 largest hidden villages had banded together to destroy the village and scatter the Uzumaki to the winds. "Are you sure you're not a Senju?" Uzumaki Hiroki laughingly asked his young cousin as he watched a boy struggle to make a basic water-holding seal for his canteen. Hiroki wasn't the best person to teach the boy for several reasons, but he was pretty much the only one who could teach him at the moment since there weren't any other Uzumaki in the caravan and they weren't likely to run into any during the trip. Unlike the child who reminded him of the younger brother he'd left behind when he'd left home, he was not and never had been a ninja. He was an old man who had gone wandering in his long-ago youth back before the fall of Uzumaki and had remained on the road since. Because he'd never been a ninja, aside from his odd and for him basically useless talent, he pretty much only knew the basics of his clan art and most of the seals he knew how to make and put together had been learned through obsessive practice and rote memorization. As he had chosen not to become a shinobi, his few talents in sealing weren't geared towards combat because his studies been more focused on the softer side of the art during his short period of interest in it before he'd set out for life on the road. "Yes, I'm sure I'm not a Senju." The boy growled as he tried the seal once more. One more failure, and the boy would be needing a new canteen. Considering the amount of chakra he was putting into his efforts, the child was already lucky that the canteen hadn't crumpled, imploded, or exploded into hundreds of pieces of lethal shrapnel that would either maim or kill anyone in their path. Sealing could be an exceedingly deadly art as well as a useful one, and failed seals could be the deadliest of all. One of the largest causes of death amongst the Uzumaki aside from death in combat had been seal failure. One of the most common causes of seal failure had been experimentation with untested seals. He himself had lost 2 close cousins to seal experiments before he left. Most of the time, when a seal failed, nothing would happen, but sometimes. The boy who resembled his Uzumaki kin in more than just looks had been almost uninterested in seals until he had offered to teach him. Apparently, aside from storage seals, the boy had lost interest for the most part due to the combination of a lack of talent and a lack of proper instruction. Aside from some rather excellent storage seals that had been mastered through constant practice and some explosive seals that had been mastered through a similar method, the boy had almost no skill in the area. Not all Uzumaki possessed the innovative talent in that field that had made the clan famous however. Many Uzumaki had gotten by on seals that they had learned through rote memorization like Naruto appeared would have to. Since he had learned how to create seals through rote memorization himself, he knew what Naruto would be going through if he didn't give up here and now. Because of that, he decided to show Naruto what he could achieve through practice if he tried often and hard enough. Going to the back of his cart, he pulled out what he considered to be his best sealing project to date, a portable mini fridge that didn't depend on electricity. Of course, one of the main methods of electricity generation for cities especially in the hidden villages was seals, but still. "Why don't you take a break and come have a look at this?" he said as he brought out the light mini fridge that he usually used for beer storage. "Wow." Naruto said as he examined the box into which a number of intricate seals had been carved. "That's a neat puzzle box." "Puzzle box?" he asked in confusion. It was at that point that the boy did something unexpected and frankly exceedingly annoying considering how much work he'd put into the mini fridge. The brat deconstructed every last one of the seals on the thing while he stood there watching in disbelief. While the Uzumaki were well known for their seals and seal masters had been rather thick on the ground while the Uzumaki had been alive, there was one type of Uzumaki who appeared once or twice a generation at most, the same type of Uzumaki he was. Like him, Naruto could pop seals apart and get into whatever they were meant to protect as if they were never there. While he would be able to learn to make them and make them work together by rote, the Naruto boy would never become a master at creating seals. No natural seal breakers ever were. Danzo smiled slightly as he looked over the latest progress reports on the program that was running at the academy. Based on the numbers, it looked that Konoha would be scrabbling to find enough jounin who could be pulled off of their missions without seriously depleting Konoha's available numbers of such to instruct the new batch of ninja that would be graduating in January. Two genin-level civilians that could be called up in dire emergencies for each active shinobi would normally be good numbers, but the number of active shinobi had seriously been slipping over the past 3 decades, creating a serious need for more active shinobi to cover both the missions that the village had been receiving, as well as home defense. For the next several years, the numbers would have to be reversed in order to bring the level of Konoha's forces up to where it should be. Based on the reports he was reading, it looked like those numbers would be met, at least for this year. Hiruzen had caught the crisis before it destroyed Konoha, reaffirming at least some of his faith in the other man. That faith had been steadily diminishing over the last few decades and had almost completely vanished within the most recent one. Seeing how quickly Konoha was turning around now that Hiruzen was aware of and paying attention to the problem, he was beginning to see the boy and later young man that he had chased after and striven to equal once more. After the way the last few years had gone, he had been starting to think that the Wako had been the brains behind the operation. While the caravan that Naruto and his team were protecting wended its way towards Tanigakure, the town of Saida was dealing with a crisis that many were coming to believe they wouldn't survive. On the day the daimyo's men had come to arrest Futuro Kinmaru, the merchant's mercenaries arrived to deal with the town as per his orders. There had been a brief battle in which the daimyo's men who had been part of the Fire Country judicial forces rather than ninja had been killed and the village overrun. Instead of fleeing like a sensible fugitive would following the murder of several of the daimyo's men, Kinmaru, who proved to be a madman as well as a criminal, stayed, believing that the town was too small and remote for anyone of importance to bother dealing with. Following Kinmaru's takeover, the townspeople of Saida were living in fear as the merchant who had taken their town ruled over them with an iron fist and severely punished those who didn't show him the proper respect. The only hope the townspeople had now was that a small boy that had slipped past the mercenary patrols would reach Konoha and that the ninja there would be inclined to help them, despite the treatment they had received at the townspeople's hands the last time they had been through. As the villagers waited and hoped, more and more of them were dragged out into the town square to be punished, as Kinmaru sat watching in his throne-like chair whilst snacking on delicacies, and a group of jeering mercenaries laughed. Every time a defiant Saida resident mentioned Konoha or the ninja whom they treated poorly at the merchant's urging, they received scoffs in return. After all, wasn't it they who had banded together and chased a team from Konoha from their town? Even if Konoha was inclined to help due to their bleeding heart nature, it wouldn't do much good. It was a well-known fact that despite strong numbers and a few well-known figures, Konoha was weak, was preparing to stand down its forces and become a tourist trap like Yugakure had done. The only reason nobody had invaded yet aside from the mutual defense treaty with Suna was the fact that Konoha had been riding on its old reputation and nobody was entirely certain whether or not the village was only playing dead. On the day the caravan reached Tanigakure and Sakura had somehow found herself in a fight with one of the locals, a small boy named Hiro stood at the gates of Konoha, wondering how he'd be able to get help from the ninja who lived there. Prior to now, he'd only heard stories about Konoha, stories that had painted it as a mystical place whose residents practiced esoteric arts that were unknown to the minds of normal hard-working men. Unfortunately, none of those stories had told him where or how to get help for his friends and family. The only thing he could think of doing was to ask the Hokage who stood ruler over all of Konoha, which was far bigger than any other town or village he'd ever seen. "Hey kid, what are you doing?" One of the gate guards who'd apparently noticed he'd been standing staring at the massive village gate for too long asked. "I need to see the Hokage." Hiro stammered nervously, remembering what he'd heard that the ninja had done to the men who had dared to kidnap some of their own. "I swear, if this is yet another brat who's run away from home to become a ninja, I'm taking him to Danzo," the other gate guard said before flagging down a passing chunin. Once the chunin who'd previously been taking advantage of his sick leave was settled in the second guard's former position, the gate guard led the boy further into the massive village that rivaled the capital in size, scope, and grandeur, despite the fact that it was centuries newer. Eventually, the two of them reached the massive administrative complex that was the heart of the village. Once there, Hiro was practically dragged to the mission assignment room because he couldn't help but stop and stare despite the urgency of his mission, having seen nothing like this place before in his short life. Standing at the back of the room behind the mission assignment desk was an old man in red and white robes who wore a red and white hat that bore the kanji for fire. This was clearly the Hokage whose ninja would be able to help his village. "There," the gate guard who'd led him from the gate said. "You've seen the Hokage, and as you can see he's a very busy man who doesn't have time for." But Hiro wasn't listening, he was doing what was probably the stupidest thing that one could do in the Hokage's presence, which was approaching the Hokage without permission. Had the elderly man who had a soft spot for children not gestured for the guards to stand down, the boy would have been dead before he had gotten within 10 feet of the man, much less close enough to kneel at the man's feet. "Please," Hiro said as he knelt before the Hokage in supplication. "I need your help." "What with?" the Hokage asked with a put-upon sigh. He received similar pleas from more important people nearly every week, and almost every request made after the initial pleading turned out to be exceedingly trivial and not worth the time or the resources needed to fulfill the request. Getting a child to do the begging was a rather novel move, however. We arrested this evil merchant who was selling people as slaves, and when the daimyo's men came to take him to the capital to be tried, the merchant's men came and killed them and took over the town. We need your help to get rid of them. Hiro replied, hoping that if he didn't mention what they'd done to the ninja who'd rescued the merchant's children, the Hokage would be more inclined to help. There's something you're hiding. The Hokage said, noting that the child showed all the classic signs. He would have dismissed the boy's begging as a stupid and suicidal prank if he hadn't received a missive that morning from the daimyo who'd requested that a team of ninjas go out and search for some of his men who'd been engaged in a prisoner transfer from a town on the hot water country border and were several days late. We didn't mean to. The boy replied in a rather guilty tone that the Hokage recognized from the days when he'd been raising his children. What didn't you mean to do? The Hokage asked. If we'd known that the merchant was lying about your ninja being with the kidnappers, we wouldn't have been rude to them and we wouldn't have tried to chase them off. The boy replied somewhat sulkily. The Hokage sighed for an entirely different reason than he had earlier after recalling the incident the boy had mentioned. On the one hand, things inside couldn't have turned out better if he'd planned it because he wouldn't have to send in operatives to covertly deal with the leaders of that little snafu over the period of several months to a couple of years. On the other, things couldn't be worse. Instead of sending out a single team to search for the remains of the party which he had previously believed had run afoul of bandits, he would be forced to send several teams out into open combat with little hope of remuneration, as everything of value had most likely already have been long since been taken from the Saida townspeople. And the daimyo would more than likely mark the mission down as one of the ones Konoha owed him each year in order to be allowed to keep operating within Fire Country's borders. Normally, Konoha got away with a bunch of cat retrieval missions and a couple of C ranks, but don't worry, child. He said with one of the smiles that had been formulated to put small children at ease. We'll still help you despite what you were tricked into doing to our ninja. Sometimes even the smartest people get tricked. Mentally marking the rescue of the township of Saida down as one of those crappy no-pay to low-pay missions that bolstered Konoha's image as the nice guys that they'd been taking on in increasing numbers over the years, the Hokage deftly deflected the small boy's exuberant display of gratitude and ordered one of the guards to take the boy to get something to eat. Considering the situation the boy had described and the likely reaction the merchant would have to being deposed from his ill-gotten post by ninja, this was likely to be the last time that boy would be happy for a long time. There was a good chance that the child was already an orphan and, until it was proven otherwise, he would recommend that the child be housed in one of the village orphanages. As far as he was concerned, the situation sucked for everyone all round. The ninja being sent to Saida would be receiving the lowest pay for that rank of mission out of the village's infrastructure funds, which would take money away from road repair and park maintenance unless other remuneration was received. He of course would have to justify his reasoning for assigning such a mission, as the number of missions gained from slightly squeamish travelers who would hire the ninja who dealt with bandits without making it rain guts wouldn't come close to making up for the ninja who would be lost in that mission. Most of all, it sucked for the Saida townspeople who would be hostages in a few short days when the mission was underway. Across the village and completely oblivious to the crisis that was brewing halfway across the country, Midokado Himura's heart pounded in a way it hadn't in years. Certainly not since his beloved wife had passed on at far too young an age when their last child who had soon followed her, a child that had been completely unexpected considering the fact that she should have been going through menopause at the time, had been born too soon. Fidgeting nervously, he once again examined the flowers he'd brought with him before knocking on the door. His heart hammered even harder in his chest as he heard coming from within the house the shuffling of a pair of dainty feet that had once sent a Kumo ninja flying over a tree before their owner had left the ninja forces in order to marry a good man who at the time he'd been upset wasn't him and start a family. Before he was ready, the door opened and a familiar face appeared. Age and arthritis may have caught up with Hitomi-chan, but she was still as beautiful to his eyes as she had been in her youth. I'd ask if Saratobi made you fetch my groceries for me again, but I haven't asked for any recently. Hitomi said when she spotted him on her doorstep, her beautiful brown eyes lit up with amusement. I Kamitagawa these. Himura squeaked as he thrust the flowers in Hitomi's face. Even at 68, she could make him feel and act like a nervous first-year academy student. Naruto sighed as the team settled into their night's camp. A few days on, and Sakura's eye was still a spectacular shade of purple, and Sakura's lip was still swollen. She apparently didn't heal nearly as fast as he did, and if those wounds didn't heal without a trace by the time they got back to Konoha, there was no telling what the girl's mother would do. The woman had gone absolutely insane when Sakura had shown up back home with a couple of scratches and a scrape or two. Nobody knew exactly who had started that fight between Sakura and the Tanigakure ninja that had resulted in those injuries, but, well, they had been there. All of the ninja of that village, few though they were, had looked as if they were spoiling for a fight. None of them had been happy that Konoha ninja had been hired to guard that caravan, considering the fact that its final destination before it split apart and each part of it went their own way was their village. One would think that the fight that would have eventually broken out, considering how much the Tani ninja seemed to want one, would have involved the Jounin rather than Sakura, but that had not been the case. The adults of the village had had the patience and control that came from more than a decade of training. Training that the genin had lacked. After pulling the pair of Kunoichi apart, Kakashi and Tetsuo sensei had hustled them out of the village as quickly as they could, without making it seem as if they were fleeing. If it appeared that they were fleeing, it would make them look guilty, and they would attract the negative attention of the villagers, who would promptly take the other Kunoichi's side in the matter, which they would still be likely to do anyway, even if she was in the wrong because she was one of theirs. That negative attention they would have received had they appeared to be leaving with a little more haste than was called for might have taken the form of a mob, which was something they wouldn't want because a Tanigakure mob would be more organized and better armed than the one that had seen them off from Saida. As they crossed river country on their way back to the border, Sasuke and Sakura got a bit of practice in tree hopping. Once Sakura finally got over her fear of falling, she took to it like a fish to water. Sasuke, who'd only just mastered the tree climbing technique to Tetsuo sensei's satisfaction, was a bit more frustrated by the technique but managed to pick it up without mishap. Thanks to Sasuke and Sakura's mastery of tree hopping, the trip back to the Fire Country border was much quicker than the trip out had been, and as soon as they reached the border, they ran to the rendezvous point where they met and relieved the team that had been patrolling the border before them. The team of teenage Chunin were rather relieved to be going home because things had gotten rather cold and the winter rain was due to start soon. While the Chunin would be cozy in their nice warm beds and Ito's mother's basement where a rec room had been set up, they would be out in it. The team's first day of border patrol had gone rather well. Kakashi and Tetsuo sensei had showed them several signs of a border incursion that they should be on the lookout for as they slowly moved along the border between fire and river. Many of the signs that Kakashi and Tetsuo sensei had created and displayed were near invisible and rather innocuous on the surface. Should they see genuine versions of any such signs during their patrols, they should call for reinforcements, send word back to Konoha in case the team didn't survive the encounter, and attempt tracking. After walking along the border for most of the day, getting a feel for the area and learning what to look out for, the team had finally stopped at a good spot that was out of the wind at around sunset and set up camp. Having set up camp so many times before, the team could practically do it in their sleep, which was one good thing to come out of the mess of the first trip the team had gone on. After getting a good night's sleep, they got back on the road, clearing up the camp in record time before taking on another day of patrol that was almost completely uneventful if one didn't count the team of Tanigakure ninja that had been shadowing them on the other side of the border. After a day of running parallel to the Tani team who were probably just waiting for an excuse to start something, they settled down a little way from the border in an area that was firmly in fire territory where they were now setting up camp. After they'd gotten tents set up rather than simply laying out on bedrolls like usual because it looked like rain or even a much rarer snow, considering how cold it was, they decided that it might be safe enough to light a small relatively smokeless cookfire that evening. That fire was a small comfort to the group and a source of envy to those who had to sit watch away from it with their back to it in order that what little light it shed wouldn't destroy their night vision. Much to Naruto's dismay, his watch was first, meaning that he would be getting a cold dinner later when Sasuke came to relieve him. After admiring Sakura's shiner once more, he reluctantly turned to face the falling darkness, hoping that no trouble would come to them in the night. He didn't hold out too much hope though, trouble almost always came to him eventually, especially when he was out of the village on what was supposed to be a routine C-rank mission, much like this one had been labeled as. While Naruto was settling in for the first watch of the evening over on the river country border, a different group of ninja were gathering near the border between fire and hot water country. Unlike Team Tetsuo however, this wasn't a border patrol force. Instead, it could almost be considered an invasion force despite the fact that what they were invading was within their own territory. This group of ninja who were all experienced career chunin were part of a force that was surrounding Saida, preparing to go in 2 hours before dawn when the mercenaries who held the village captive were at their least alert. Hidden in the woods that surrounded the town of Saida and the massive orchards that ringed the town were several teams of experienced ninja, of which the group was one. Like most members of the force who had been sent to Saida, every member of this team was a veteran of the Third War and one was even a veteran of the Second. They, like the other teams, had been hand-selected by the Hokage in order to minimize casualties. The less ninja that were lost in this mess, the better. As they stood vigilantly waiting, hoping that the element of surprise wasn't blown and that this wouldn't turn into the bad sort of bloodbath when they went in, one of the operatives who had been sent in ahead of the mission to gather intel came to the group to provide a sitrep on conditions within the village. On this sort of mission where the entire continent would be dissecting their actions that night for a long time, it wouldn't do to accidentally kill a bunch of civilians and accidentally bypass a bunch of mercenaries who would then attack you the instant your back was turned. 2 minutes after the intel operative arrived, the group was standing around a rough map of the town they would be liberating early in the morning, attempting to memorize the layout and points of interest. They weren't the team that would be sent in to capture the merchant and bring him before the daimyo, who would most likely have him publicly executed as a warning to others who might consider stealing sections of the outer reaches of his territory, but that didn't mean that their role in this was unimportant however. They would be one of several teams that would be helping to clear the way for that team and liberating the small town that merchant had taken over. After planning for a while longer and getting a bit of food and a few hours of sleep so they would be alert when the time came, the time to move in came. Unlike the ninja battles most people pictured, having seen or heard of the titanic battles that took place between the strongest of ninja during times of war or other times of strife, the sort of battles that young ninja aspired to when they saw their first A-rank jutsu at the academy, there were no large explosions or fancy jutsu. They ran through the town silently, leaving death in their wake, killing mercenaries as they slept in their beds, on bedrolls, and drunkenly passed out in alleys. They ran silent, deadly, and completely unseen. Rather than being customer pleasers who put on a show that was meant to impress and intimidate whoever may be watching, they were true ninja in every way that night. Then, somewhere across town, someone screamed. While ninja ran through the streets of Saida killing mercenaries left and right, Kisame and Itachi stood outside of Kumagakure after having rather swiftly completed the mission to which they had been assigned before Itachi had taken his little detour and having finally had that long-awaited talk that Itachi had been avoiding for nearly 2 weeks. They had talked for most of the evening after Itachi had finally given in and told him what he'd been avoiding telling him for years, and then a long silence had fallen, probably the longest silence in Kisame's entire life. "So, let me get this straight," Kisame said, almost wishing he hadn't had that discussion with his partner. "Madara practically forced you to join the Akatsuki after he helped you kill your entire clan, which you did for Konoha to whom you are still loyal, and that the reason you killed the clan was to protect your little brother because they were all going to be executed for treason, because they were planning a coup, and if someone else did it, your brother would have been killed as well." "That's pretty much sums it up, yes." Itachi replied in that same emotionless tone he almost always used, the same tone in which he narrated a tale of what could be considered treachery to the cause that he'd apparently never supported in the first place. "You know, I think I liked it better when you were quiet about your past, so you wouldn't have to lie to me," Kisame said as he started walking down the road they had been standing in the middle of when Itachi had finally given in and talked, unsure of what to think or feel about his partner, who was still something approaching a friend at the moment. Hey, at least Itachi was honest. The clear sky over Konoha seems to mock them as they stand there in the cemetery, watching as the coffins containing their comrades, their loved ones were interred. The arctic light of the late autumn sun seems to almost call spring to mind, but holds none of the warmth that comes with a season of rebirth. It was just as well, considering that this was a funeral. Just as well that this day would come as the year died, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, threatening to strip away the last of the blue from the sky, much as the passing of the deceased had stripped the joy from the hearts of those who loved them. Aside from the friends and the family of the deceased, only 12 other shinobi bothered to attend. In a village that boasts about 10,000 shinobi on its rolls, most of them genin who have gone on to do other things until they are called up in an emergency or time of war, that seems surprisingly few to turn out for the deaths of 3 of their own. But the truth was that despite the fact that they'd killed to protect one of their own from an outsider, be they foreigner or suicidal civilian, the ninja forces weren't as tight-knit as some would think, and most didn't see the point in turning out en masse to see the burial of a virtual stranger or 3. Those of the acquaintances of the deceased who had been unable to come due to missions or other obligations would likely drop by and pay their respects in their own time. No mission ever goes without a hitch of some sort, be it a stubbed toe on a D rank or the death of an entire team on an S rank, and the mess in Saida was no exception. The loss of only 3 of their number and 10 of the Saida townsfolk, not counting those who died before Konoha had gotten involved, could be considered reasonably good, considering the way such missions often go. Trained fighters of any stripe will be able to spot when they were outclassed, and when someone who knows that they wouldn't be walking away from things alive was backed into a corner where they had available hostages at hand, things tended to get messy, much as they had done in Saida when the last knot of mercenaries had been alerted to the attack by a screaming civilian. Let it not be said that the Konoha shinobi hadn't given at least 10 times as good as they got however. All of the mercenaries who had occupied the small border town of Saida at the time Konoha had attacked had been killed. Those who had fled had been hunted down and slaughtered over the next couple of days, and the merchant who'd hired them had been publicly executed just that morning as a warning to those who thought they might try something like that within the borders of the Fire Daimyo's lands in the future, and the fat man's head had been placed on a pike and put on display soon afterward. But all of that was a cold comfort to those that had been left behind by the fallen. Eventually, the coffins had been lowered into the graves and the bodies had been buried, and the last of the loved ones of the fallen had made their way back to continue their lives, even though an integral part of them was missing. Hibachi, who had found himself staring at his father's grave until the clouds had finally swept in as they'd been threatening to do since morning and a freezing rain had started pouring down, was the last to leave. At that point, he was just too numb to cry, though he knew that the tears would come again later. He'd always known that there was a chance that since he was a shinobi, his father could die in the line of duty, but he'd never really considered what that had truly meant until now. Before then, it had always been someone else's father, her uncle, her mother, her sister, her aunt, or brother who died. Now, it wasn't. Now it was his turn to look up every time the front door opened before realization hit and that closed look came upon his face. His turn to come out to the cemetery every day until duty pulled him away and he finally stopped coming. His turn to be the boy whose father died while, and the only thing he could think was that he wanted his father. As he silently made his way home where his mother who'd not stopped crying since she'd received the news would undoubtedly have a cold meal waiting for him, he barely registered the fact that someone had approached him when he was still 3 blocks away from his house and didn't bother to acknowledge this person's presence until they tapped him on the shoulder. "What do you want?" he snarled at Ami, whose presence was rather unwelcome at that moment. I just wanted to say how sorry I was that Ami stammered. "Whatever, just go away," he said coldly, turning his back on the girl and storming onward towards the home his father would never return to. He didn't want or need Ami's pity, or anyone else's for that matter. Being a medic of near unparalleled skill, there were many things that Kabuto could do that most humans could not. If he received a blow that wasn't fatal, he could, if given time, regenerate from it. If poisoned, he could recover and so on and so forth. One thing he could not do however was cure the common cold. As he stood there under the freezing rain in the northern reaches of Fire Country near the Sound border, he idly noted that the cough that had started a couple days before had settled into his chest and gotten worse, and that the current weather which looked like it would be staying indefinitely if past years were any indication wasn't helping. That couldn't be helped though, since he and his team of overage genin, who'd repeatedly been told that they should pack it in and give up already were on border patrol, and therefore he would not be able to get out of the rain for another week. He would most definitely be having words with the man who ran the supply shop that he usually frequented, since the waterproof cloak he'd sold him clearly wasn't, despite the fact that it had been marked as having been tested to the point where one could pretty much go swimming in the damn thing, shake it off, and have it be completely dry within 5 minutes. The reality when it came to the garment was nowhere near as advertised, seeing as it had become completely soaked through after 3 hours out in a steady downpour, and the clothing underneath fared no better. He was completely soaked to the skin and wouldn't be able to dry off until he and his team made camp in another 2 hours. As soon as his and his teammates' true loyalties were made known and they returned to Itagakure where they belonged for good, he was going to make damn sure that he never ran another border patrol mission again. There was a reason that the older shinobi left this assignment to the older genin and newbie chunin when they had the opportunity to do so after all. As he ducked under what little shelter a nearby tree provided as his team took a break and he coughed so hard he could barely breathe, Kabuto once again cursed the bastard who had gotten him sick. If he ever found out who was responsible for his current condition, he would kill them slowly and painfully. Naruto nervously stepped over the border into Suna where he and his team would be taking a joint bandit clearing mission, half expecting he'd explode or something the instant he did so. Even Tetsuo-sensei was watching somewhat nervously as he stepped over the invisible line that separated the land of wind from the land of rivers, marking the absolute end of the border patrol mission that the team had taken. His and Tetsuo's nervousness as they made their way out of river country and into wind had practically been palpable, and it was making the rest of the team edgy. All 3 of the others found themselves sweeping for threats and not relaxing as they found none, wondering what it was the other 2 had sensed that they could not. The reason for Naruto and Tetsuo's state of nervousness was because the border patrol mission had been a completely routine one on which absolutely nothing had happened. Just about everything was poised to go wrong, what with the pissed off team of Tani ninja tailing them on their side of the border and the rumors of a band of bandits being in the area, but despite all of that, absolutely nothing had happened aside from everyone getting rained on. Even as the team had made their run through the land of rivers, passing several ninja teams as they skirted around to Nigakure, nothing happened. The Tani ninja had been positively well behaved and had limited themselves to the occasional rude gesture whenever they came into view. Heck, they didn't even say a single goddamn word when Sasuke decided to return several of their gestures with ones of his own that had been made in international, so there would be absolutely no doubt as to what he was saying. With all of that nothing, both Naruto and Tetsuo had found themselves growing increasingly tense as they waited for the first shoe to drop and squash them absolutely flat. The crossing into Wind Country was completely uneventful however, as was the short trip to the rendezvous point where they would be meeting the team Franz Suna that they'd be working with for the next several days. When he first caught sight of them, Naruto thought that the Suna team that had been sent to work with them looked rather interesting. The teacher appeared to be missing an eye based on the way that half of his face was covered. The girl whose dark blonde hair was tied back into 4 ponytails carried a fan that marked her as either a wind or fire user. The taller boy was wearing kabuki makeup and dressed like a Bunraku puppeteer, and the third boy. "Hey, are you in Uzumaki?" Naruto called over to the red-haired boy who had a massive gourd strapped to his back. Aki stared at the team that had come to help his team clear out a bandit nest. Apparently, the Kazukiya's attempt at brinkmanship had backfired. In response to Gaara, Konoha had sent their own Jinchuriki. Up until the boy's debut at the Kurigaku Chunin exams in which the child had torn a genin team from Iwa apart, most of the nations had gone on blissfully unaware of exactly who Konoha's Jinchuriki was. Others had even believed the story that Konoha had put out that their Yondaime Hokage had actually destroyed the Kyuubi, and others still had posited that the Yondaime had merely dragged it into death with him as he'd reputedly summoned the Shinigami during the Kyuubi attack, which had reputedly caused the destruction of a rather sizable section of Konoha. In the years since the treaty between Suna and Konoha had been made, it had become increasingly apparent that it was an exceedingly one-sided deal, and it wasn't Suna who were reaping the benefits of the alliance that they'd made because they hadn't been strong enough to face a full-scale war with Iwa on their own, especially since Kumo and sometimes Kiri tended to jump in on Iwa's side. Over the last decade and change since the end of the most recent war, Konoha had increasingly been receiving missions that should have gone to Suna. Case in point being this mission which could have been tended to by 2 Suna teams or even one in a pinch, and ended up being split between Suna and Konoha, meaning that Suna would only be receiving half the pay for this mission, despite the fact that it was taking place within Wind Country's borders. In the past year, there had been some rumblings of what looked like it might be a potential war to those who paid attention to the signs, but they seemed to be subsiding a bit. There had been increased invasion drills in which his team had participated over the last couple of months. That, and the Kazukiya had ordered every Suna shinobi to get into fighting shape and started calling up the genin reserves in small batches each week despite the fact that there weren't any missions for them to take. Konoha had responded to this increased activity on their part by revamping their academy curriculum and calling failed students back to the academy, citing a traitor amongst the academy teaching staff as the reason. The fact that this was happening now however couldn't possibly be a coincidence. Considering Suna's move and Konoha's counter-move, Gaara had likely been placed on this mission in order to cause an incident of some sort in order to see how Konoha would react. If they followed the pattern they had been following, Konoha would roll over and take it like they had during that incident with Kumo and the Hyuga and several incidents afterward. If that happened, they would know that they could go for Konoha's soft underbelly, since a few new books and a few new recruits wouldn't change how weak the village was at the top, nor how incompetent the current generation of genin was. If Konoha didn't back down in the name of peace and demanded compensation for whatever injuries or deaths Gaara might cause however, they would have to carefully withdraw and adjust their plans accordingly. If Konoha, which had been doing everything they could to maintain peace, didn't declare war on them, that point was moot now however. Konoha had rather promptly given them their answer by rather pointedly reminding them that they had a Jinchuriki of their own. A Jinchuriki who would be able to survive whatever Gaara dished out and return it in spades if even a quarter of the rumors he'd heard about the boy were true. The boy possessed the strongest of the Biju after all. As he stood there trying to figure out how the hell he was supposed to deal with a slightly oversized team that had both Konoha's Jinchuriki and the Yondaime Hokage's former student on it, which, considering what that man's father had done to Suna's forces in the Second War, was another firm statement that Konoha wouldn't be backing down this time. The Jinchuriki opened his mouth and yelled out a question that completely threw him for a loop. He knew that he didn't resemble the Uzumaki in the slightest, therefore the question had to have been directed at one of his students. Was the boy seriously questioning the paternity of one of the Kazukiya's children? Quickly looking at where the Jinchuriki seemed to be focused, he realized that the boy had asked Gaara that question. Gaara, whose paternity had been called into question before, in spite of the boy's strong resemblance to his father, thanks to the red hair and the green eyes that were a mark of the Ichibi's possession. This was not going to be good. Gaara blinked, stared, blinked again and tried to reboot his brain. That was most definitely the strangest first reaction to his presence that anyone had had in living memory. Normally, there was a great deal more quivering in fear and hisses of monster, sometimes even a bit of screaming as well. Of course, most people he ran into were in or from Suna, and the ones who weren't were almost always people he was in the process of killing as part of a mission, but still. As he was trying to figure out how the hell to react to this, e.g. ignored, and the one who said it since he looked too weak to confirm his existence, and mother wasn't calling for his blood, or if he should kill the boy in case what he'd asked had been meant as an insult or something, Tamari spoke up. "Why the hell are you asking if my brother's in Uzumaki?" Tamari yelled indignantly. Well, he's got red hair, and the old dude who's like my cousin or something has red hair, and my mother had red hair, and since the old dude and my mother were Uzumaki, I thought maybe he would be in Uzumaki too, and we'd be like cousins to Bayo. The blonde boy with the whisker markings on his cheeks who was wearing an outfit that was of various shades of muted oranges and brown said. He blinked again as he wondered what the hell was going on in the blonde boy's head. Whatever it was, aside from the fact that it was tangentially about him, it quite likely didn't concern him. Deciding to ignore the strange blonde for the moment, he turned his attention to the rest of the team, which, with 5 members, looked slightly unwieldy, too large to be a proper squad, and too small for anything else. Aside from the blonde who'd been hoping he was a cousin, there were 2 jounin, which was 1 jounin too many for the group, there was a somewhat nervous pink-haired girl, and there was a dark-haired boy who had eyes that were somewhat familiar, eyes like his own but not. As the dark-haired boy turned, possibly to say something to the blonde boy who'd quite likely ruined the team's first impression with his strange little outburst, he caught sight of the edge of a red and white clan sigil on his back. "Achiha!" Mother screamed in his mind. "Kill it. Kill it. Kill it." He ignored his mother's screams for now, for the sake of the mission of nothing else, seeing as he didn't want to be a total disgrace to his village, and killing a member of a foreign team in front of said foreigners, when it wasn't an objective of the mission, would be an exceedingly stupid move that would bring embarrassment to Suna. He'd learned through experience that he could ignore mother when she got like this for a little while, but eventually it got to be too much, and he'd have to do something to sate her desires. Fortunately, people who were too stupid to live had a tendency to show up before things got too bad. If worst came to worst, he could do as mother wished, but he would try to hold off on that for as long as possible. "My name's Uzumaki Naruto, what's yours?" The blonde boy asked him when the teams had finally come together and Baki and the 2 Konoha jounin had gone off to trade notes. "Ara," he replied, barely paying attention to the blonde, more focused on the dark-haired boy who had caused mother to have such a reaction. "Nice to meet you, Gara," the blonde boy said rather cheerfully. He remained silent. He wasn't sure how to deal with this boy who was behaving so far outside what he considered to be normal, that normal couldn't be found with a telescope. The boy seemed to be reasonably nice, but that would more than likely end in trouble. The last time anyone had treated him with anything approaching true kindness had been his uncle Yashimaru, and he knew how that ended. It was entirely possible that his father had hired these Konoha ninja to take him out, and the blonde one was meant to get him to drop his guard somehow. If that were the case, the blonde boy would die like all the rest who had tried before him. Kakashi frowned when he caught sight of how the jounin from Suna was looking at Naruto. This could potentially be trouble, especially considering how the man had tensed up when Naruto had approached the red-haired boy that he'd taken to be a possible Uzumaki. Since Tetsuo was team leader for this mission, he had taken the lead in asking about the specifics of the mission and the plan they would have going in, while he hung back and watched. He would continue to watch, since he had the feeling that something was not quite right about the situation, and it seemed to center around the red-haired boy who looked to be around Naruto's age. If something happened to Naruto, however, he would do much more than watch. Much more. And, whether or not this Baki survived at the end of it would depend on exactly how strong the man was, and exactly how much more punishment his body could take in comparison to his own. Naruto frowned. They'd been on this bandit clearing mission for 3 days, and last night and the night before they had shared body heat rather than lit a fire so as not to alert their quarry. During both nights, Gaara had gone off by himself and his teammates had let him despite the fact that he was obviously cold and sleep deprived. Deciding to solve this mystery, he got up and walked over to the other boy. "Why are you over here on your own?" he asked as he sat down next to the boy who'd gone from strange to downright maniacal when they'd cleared out that last bandit nest. Having seen a number of strange techniques, Gaara's control over the nearby sand hadn't fazed him, but the sheer brutality of his attacks on the unfortunate bandits had. The attacks the jounin made on the bandits who ran in their direction in order to escape Gaara had seemed almost merciful in comparison. There was less blood for one, and there were more clean cuts rather than crush injuries for another. Sakura had completely frozen up at the first nest of bandits, but when her life had come directly into danger and nobody could come to her rescue because everyone else was busy fighting one of the largest bandit gangs that had been seen in a long while, she had come unfrozen and clumsily done what she'd been trained to do. If she hadn't lucked out and gotten a civilian, it didn't bear thinking about. She'd lucked out, end of story. They'd been clearing out the nests of bandits they'd come across in their search of the desert during the day, despite the heat and the risk of dehydration, because the bandits expected ninja to come in at night and tended to be more alert during the night because of this. The normal bandit sleep schedule accommodated afternoon attacks on merchant caravans, when their prey would be less on guard because they were more focused on where and when they would make camp, and nighttime raids by shinobi. By coming in during the day, using jutsu to keep cool, keep from going sandland, and keep hydrated, the ninja tended to catch them with their pants down, sometimes literally. Mother wants their blood. Gaara said somewhat matter-of-factly, though there was a trace of his earlier bloodthirstiness which had startled the hell out of him earlier in his voice, pulling him out of his reflections on their bandit hunting expedition. I can't, however, not yet. It'll bring disgrace to the village and I'll never hear the end of it from him. Wondering how a ninja with so many issues had managed to be sent out into the field, he scooted away from Gaara slightly. He decided not to get up and leave just yet, since Gaara seemed to be in control, if only just. What of your mother? Gaara asked, looking at him somewhat curiously. She died the day I was born, during the Kyuubi attack, her and my father both. Naruto replied, having the oddest feeling that that probably wasn't what the other boy was asking about. Kyuubi attack? Gaara asked, startling Naruto, who thought everyone in the world had heard of the Kyuubi attack by now, especially since he'd rather spectacularly though completely unwittingly let a certain cat out of the bag in Kiri a while back. A cat that somehow rather strangely still seemed to be in the bag in parts of Konoha, despite the fact that it had gone and left the building entirely. The day I was born, the Kyuubi appeared out of nowhere and attacked the village. Naruto said. Most people seemed to think that the Uchiha were responsible somehow. It kinda makes sense since the last time anyone had seen the Kyuubi before then it was under Madara's control, and the Uchiha clan suffered almost zero casualties during the attack. Where'd you learn all that? Sasuke piped up from where he was curled up between Kakashi and Tetsuo-sensei. A couple old history books, the October 15th issue of the Capital Courier, and some old gossip that makes sense now if I put your name in rather than mine. Naruto replied. The Capital Courier didn't outright say it, but they printed out the casualty lists by family, mentioned that nobody could remember seeing Uchiha Fugaku and a number of other Uchiha during the attack, and let people draw their own conclusions. Tetsuo-sensei forcing him to read had broadened his horizon significantly. One area that he'd rather naturally read up on had been the Kyuubi attack, since it involved his greatest hero, the Yondaime. Some of the old history books which hadn't been assigned as required reading at the academy had been enlightening to say the least. The fact that the Kyuubi had been involved at the Battle of the Valley of the End had been something he hadn't previously known, despite the fact that the Kyuubi had had a major hand in creating that valley. Based on the look on Sasuke's face, the other boy had apparently known little to none of this, which he found surprising, considering the fact that it directly concerned the boy's clan. If someone had accused his clan of doing something like turning the Kyuubi loose, he'd want to know why. Then again, since most of the villagers were all smiles when Sasuke was around, it was entirely possible that he hadn't learned that anyone had accused his clan of anything. Why everyone was all smiles when Sasuke was around, especially with the accusations that had been made against his clan, he didn't know. It was possible that they were afraid he'd snap and imitate his older brother, but with the village as targets, rather than his now virtually non-existent clan. Would your village leave the lot of them alive for another 8 years after that? Baki asked, looking honestly curious. No proof. Kakashi replied from where he'd been lightly dozing. They were a founding clan, and if we off them without any proof, it'd look bad for the village. Yeah, Baki said after a moment of reflection. It would, considering that Konoha was first, and the Senju Uchiha peace was considered a major miracle, and evidence that peace was possible. Good thing for you that Uchiha Itachi took them out before they could have offed your current Jinchuriki while he was still untrained though. What's a Jinchuriki? Sakura asked, showing that everyone was awake and listening. Baki and his students all gave Sakura incredulous stares, even Gaara. Kakashi and Tetsuo-sensei both winced, and Sasuke still looked somewhat horrified by the casual mention of the massacre of his clan in that semi-detached way of his. How could she not know what a Jinchuriki is? Kankuro said in the tone of voice that one would use when one is particularly awed by the level of someone's stupidity and/or ignorance. The Hokage decided that those who didn't remember the Kyuubi attack would not be told certain things in order to not prejudice them. Seeing as the parents already knew, the plan rather spectacularly backfired, and most of the children were taught by them and the other adults in the village to ostracize a certain someone without knowing why. Tetsuo-sensei said, sounding as if he'd just swallowed something particularly bitter. There were certain hard feelings in the wake of the attack, and they rather unfortunately got transferred onto the one individual who could be considered to be completely blameless in the matter. Ouch. Kankuro said, wincing slightly. I'd hate to meet Konoha's Jinchuriki. You already have. Baki said, nodding towards Naruto. How could they have met our Jinchuriki when we haven't? Asked Sakura, who hadn't seen the nod in Naruto's direction, which had set Kankuro to staring at him as if he were a specimen in a zoo, cutting across Kankuro's exclamation of "but, he's so normal." You mean you haven't told them, even after that mess in Kiri? Baki asked, looking somewhat stupefied by shock. The law's still in place. Kakashi primly replied. If anyone from Konoha breaks it. I see, Baki said. Sakura, not being happy to be left out of the loop, wondered what was going on. Sasuke however was rapidly slotting pieces into place and not liking the picture they were beginning to form. A picture involving a clan that had practically shut itself away from the village, becoming more isolated than even the Hyuga or the Aburim, who generally kept themselves to themselves when they weren't on duty, and a certain teammate of his. A certain teammate of his who had been born on the day of the Kyuubi attack. It's Naruto. Sasuke said as a certain memory came unbidden, a memory of his father, pointing out a grubby-looking blonde and telling him to stay away from him. Naruto's the Jinchuriki. But, what is a Jinchuriki? Sakura asked as she studied the boy she'd been told was dangerous before she'd seen it for herself. Hour of human sacrifice. Baki said, almost relishing the opportunity to teach the Konoha brats an unpleasant lesson which would disillusion them in regards to their favorite hero. Your Yondaime Hokage didn't destroy the Kyuubi as you claim. He sealed it inside that boy. Where or how he managed to find an actual Uzumaki to use as the host considering how thin on the ground they are, I do not know. Naruto's got a demon in him. Sakura shrieked, potentially alerting every bandit in the elemental nations to their presence. Suffice to say, almost nobody got any sleep that night. Sakura, who had been heading for one since she'd first become a genin, finally had her major freakout, and Kakashi and Tetsuo sensei had been stuck trying to bring her down. Kankuro continued to stare at him as if he were a zoo exhibit since he was normal. Sasuke had sat there staring at him like he didn't know what the hell he was. Baki, who'd slept the night before, had watched all of this as if it were primetime entertainment, and Gaara sat impassively listening to his mother, while Naruto sat watching all of them, wondering what things were going to be like in the future, now that his teammates knew. All in all, the only person who got any sleep that night was Temari, who found the discussion of Jinchuriki to be boring, since she'd heard talk about such things for most of her life, since her youngest brother was one. The next day, the combined team cleared out one last bandit nest, which they'd practically stumbled over, and bid each other farewell, before breaking apart into two teams and making their way towards their respective villages. Both Sakura and Sasuke gave Naruto a wide berth as they sandwalked and later tree-hopped their way home, Sakura giving Naruto a wider berth than Sasuke, who continued to look at him as if he were trying to figure out what he was and exactly where in his world he was supposed to fit. The Buto lay on a hospital bed a bit too far gone to reflect on the fact that Orochimaru was probably going to kill him for catching pneumonia right before he was due to leave for some necessary intelligence gathering at the Chunin exams. The rain hadn't let up while he was on the border, and neither had his cough or the fever that settled in to roost with the cough, despite the number of remedies he'd ingested in an attempt to rid himself of both. His teammates had been forced to carry him back to the village, and now he was in the ICU, shaking, burning with fever, and barely able to breathe. Being in no condition to worry about how or even if his team was going to get to Suna without him, Kabuto continued to breathe in and breathe out, struggling to make each breath not be his last, while hospital staff nervously hovered over his bedside. It was a couple days after Naruto had returned to Konoha from his latest mission. Feeling out of sorts about things, he had settled himself on the swing in the tree by the academy as he usually did when he was feeling somewhat depressed. There were two things that were currently bugging him, his new teammates who seemed to be shutting him out now that they'd learned he was the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, and the Chunin exams which a number of genin teams were already leaving for. The rejection from his teammates after it was revealed that he had the Kyuubi inside of him had stung, but not nearly as much as it would have if he didn't have precious people who had seen him at his worst and still cared about him anyways. Suzume, Satoshi, and Kurosaki had seen him when he'd released a portion of the Kyuubi's chakra, tore two people apart and nearly tore them apart, and they were still willing to associate with him when they weren't busy with missions of their own. If his current teammates wanted to cut him out of their lives without having witnessed anything even remotely close to that, it was their loss. Besides, it was just Sasuke the jerk and his biggest fangirl. Another thing that stung was that despite the fact that his sensei had tried his best to keep his promise, he'd still not been able to participate in the Chunin exams through no fault of his own. He'd been somewhat looking forward to them and the chance of promotion they represented, despite what had happened to him and his team the last time he'd participated. He'd also been dreading them out of fear of what could happen to his new team, which was even more inexperienced than the last one as well. As a result, despite the fact that it stung somewhat that he wasn't going, he felt both relieved and disappointed that he wouldn't be participating in the exams this time, which made him feel mixed up since he didn't think he should be feeling relieved that he wasn't going. As he began to gently sway back and forth on the swing, he noticed Tetsuo-sensei approaching him with a wide smile on his face. Wondering what it is sensei so happy, he watched the man approach in apparent good cheer, and he greeted his sensei a little less sullenly than he would have a minute earlier when he reached him because he was more curious than depressed at that moment. Ikushi Kabuto is sick. Tetsuo-sensei said as he stood over him looking rather cheerful. I managed to finagle a few things the moment I found out. You mean he started, almost not daring to hope. Kabuto's team was older than him, more experienced, and they had only not managed to make Chunin through a run of seriously bad luck. A big part of that bad luck was Kabuto who wouldn't be there to muck things up for them, however he managed to do so every time considering this would have been lucky number 7 for the young man if he hadn't fallen ill. You'd better hurry up and get packed. You're leaving for Suna in an hour. Tetsuo-sensei said. Your team will be waiting for you by the eastern gate. He leapt off of the swing with a whoop of joy as he realized that he wouldn't be missing another shot at promotion, while Suzume and Satoshi continued on without him and started running to his apartment. He'd have to send Kabuto a thank you note and a get well present. It never once occurred to him to tell Sasuke and Sakura the good news. Mikado Yoroi, Tsurugi Misumi, and their sensei who'd been a student of Orochimaru's alongside Anko, stood at the eastern gate, nervously awaiting the arrival of their final member. They'd nearly not gone since they were sans Kabuto, but the Uzumaki sensei who was desperate to see his student promoted had done an end run around them and gone straight to the Hokage. So now, in less than an hour they would be departing with a very serious risk to their cover in their midst since you just didn't say no to the Hokage. The kid isn't a complete blockhead. Yoroi said. He's going to know something's up and we can't ninjutsu him for the entire trip. If he's going to know something's up, why don't we make him think it's something else that would allow us to be secretive without being suspicious? Misumi said. What could possibly? You're not suggesting the team's Jounin commander said as he suddenly got what Misumi was hinting at. We'll have to take a few for the team, but if the brat's convinced that we're just one of those teams that take teamwork to a whole new level, Misumi replied. You do realize that Kabuto's going to kill us for this when he gets better, right? Yoroi said. Come on, Misumi replied. If Kabuto were all that concerned about his reputation, he wouldn't have taken the Chunin exam 6 times and made himself look like the next eternal genin. The Uzumaki caught Niji's eye as he made his way to his team's training grounds following that day's remedial lessons at the academy. Despite the fact that he'd briefly been in his class before he transferred over to the class that was a year below his prior to graduating a year prior to him and the reputation that preceded him. Niji didn't really know the Uzumaki boy from a hole in the wall and could have continued not noticing him forever if that giant fruit basket that was balanced on the boy's blonde head hadn't caught his eye. And I'm going to trust you to not let Satoshi into my apartment unsupervised. I'm sorry I couldn't play ninja with you today as planned, but things kinda happen last minute and if I don't get going, I'll be really late. The Uzumaki boy said as he gave the honorable grandson a set of keys and what were obviously last-minute instructions. Deciding that it was none of his business, he continued on his way to his team meeting. If he were Lee, he might have asked about the fruit basket, but he wasn't, so he didn't. The first thing Kabuto noticed when his mind regained some semblance of coherence was the massive fruit basket by his bed. At first, he thought he might have been hallucinating when he caught sight of it, but after closing his eyes a couple of times and opening them again to find a giant slightly blurry fruit basket full of hothouse fruits which had been grown out of season, he realized it was real. The nurse who'd been sitting there watching him to make sure he didn't die on her when she turned around to do some paperwork, smiled when she noticed the direction he was looking in. It was rather sweet of him, even if you can't eat them just yet. The nurse said. It came with a card though. Somewhat bewildered by the fact that someone had sent him a card and a fruit basket which nobody had done for him before, Kabuto hastily gave something that could be construed as a cent when the nurse asked if he wanted her to read the card. Dear Kabuto, the nurse read. Thanks for opening a spot on your team for me. Sorry it had to happen in such a sucky manner though. Uzumaki Naruto. His fever-slowed mind took a long time to process this strange message from the Kyuubi Jinchuriki and exactly what it meant. Then, it hit him. It hit him like a ton of brick masonry which had tumbled off of a previously stable building without warning, catching him by surprise. The only thing Kabuto could think as he laid back and the implications of the card began to fully blossom in his mind as myriad scenarios played nightmarishly before his eyes was shit. 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 At night, Kabuto's feverish nightmares were of a small blonde boy turning into a monster and destroying everything. Sakura sighed as she picked at her breakfast, a meal that she'd prepared for herself in her own apartment rather than had her mother prepare for her at home in an attempt to lure her back, which she was sorely tempted to let work despite the fact that she was still on the hook for the apartment. Days spent in solitude, even knowing that she wasn't completely alone in the world, had gotten her. She'd needed the time to think however. Since she'd graduated, she'd had just about everything she thought she knew pulled out from under her, and what she thought to be solid facts were shaky at best and outright lies at worst. It left her shaken, confused, and with a new and unwanted understanding of the old, saying that to a ninja, all truths are relative. One area that her thoughts kept circling back to since a certain secret had been revealed back in Wind Country was Naruto, who'd proven to be both more and less dangerous than she thought him to be. More dangerous in that he contained the strongest of the Biju and possessed more power than she could ever hope to have. Less dangerous in that the boy who had the power to utterly destroy her and the capability to kill her in an instant had merely restrained her, told her what was what, and only threatened to break her arm after she had provoked him. Everyone had been provoking him all of his life, and yet the village was still standing, and the inhabitants walked the streets completely unmolested by the Jinchuriki that they'd been telling their children to stay away from because he was dangerous. After the revelation that Naruto had a demon sealed inside him had been made, she'd been afraid of, well, more afraid than usual of Naruto at first, but then she'd started mentally comparing him to that other one who'd been sacrificing bandits to his mother and generally freaking the fuck out of everyone. The one who had his teammates who were also his siblings walking on eggshells around him in case he decided to do to them what he'd done to the bandits. In comparison to that, Naruto at his worst was practically sweetness and light. At least Naruto hadn't taken an almost bloodthirsty pleasure in killing when she saw him do it. After she'd gotten over a great deal of her fear of Naruto, she'd been ashamed and unable to find anything to say to him to make up for her treatment of him. It had been Naruto who'd gone out of his way to prevent her from making what could have been the biggest mistake of her life after all, so it wasn't like she could just go up to him and say, hi Naruto. I'm sorry for being a total bitch to you because my parents taught me to be that way. Not all of the blame could be laid squarely in her parents' laps. She'd been violent towards him, aggressive and cruel when he'd been nothing but nice if overly persistent towards her. She couldn't avoid Naruto forever however, seeing as they were on the same team and all. Now that their post-mission break was over, they would be having a team meeting today, and she'd be seeing him there. It wasn't like she could skirt around him during team training, especially if they were going to be sparring together, and it wasn't like she could block out his presence for the rest of the meeting, so she didn't have to think about how horrible she and almost everyone else had been to him either. Resolving to start talking to him then since they'd be seeing each other, she prayed she wouldn't lose her nerve or worse stand there stammering as she tried to find the words for what. An apology for her actions most certainly, but what else? What could she actually talk with Naruto about after she'd said, I'm sorry in order to assuage her guilty conscience? Sasuke checked the supplies in his pouch for a third time, stalling for time as he braced himself for the first team meeting since they'd returned to Konoha. Currently, just about everything he knew was tipped on its ear, and the Uzumaki who would be there and therefore couldn't be completely avoided was to blame, hence the stalling. He couldn't stall for too long however, or he'd be late, which was a very bad thing as he'd learned through any number of lectures when he was younger. As his parents had taught him, in order for the world to have meaning, it had to have order. Everything had to fit where it belonged. The Uchiha had their place just as everyone else had their places. The Uzumaki upset that order several times however, constantly refusing to stay where he'd been put and constantly tipping his world on its ear every time he turned around. When Naruto first came into his notice, aside from the time his father had pointed him out as someone the Uchiha didn't associate with if they could avoid it, he'd been the failure, the one who never succeeded at anything he tried to do, even be funny. The instructors and everyone else around him had all confirmed this categorization, so he placed Naruto as being so beneath his notice that it wasn't even funny, believing him to be securely fastened there. Being beneath him, the Uzumaki had been marked down as not worth any of his attention, no matter how much the boy clamored for it. Then, the Uzumaki graduated 2 years early, completely upsetting the order of things. That was not how the world worked. Everything he'd been taught stated that geniuses graduated before and above failures. The teachers had all told him that he wasn't and hadn't been ready to graduate when he'd asked after the Uzumaki had graduated, despite the fact that it should have been a complete impossibility for him to do so. If the boy at the top of the class wasn't ready, the dead last most definitely wasn't and therefore couldn't possibly have graduated. Convinced that there had been a mistake somewhere, he'd told himself and everyone who would listen that the Uzumaki had not graduated as had been reported and order returned to his world as the Uzumaki vanished from his sight. While he hadn't been looking, the Uzumaki had risen above him in strength and skill. Being above him, the Uzumaki became a progress marker like all those currently above him were, something he could measure himself against and surpass in his quest to gain the power he needed to kill that man and avenge his clan. As he was putting the Uzumaki in a little box marked rival, things went crashing over on their head again however. Now, not only did Uzumaki Naruto completely defy categorization, since he had absolutely none of the context he needed in order to properly place a demon container, but he was learning that his own clan had been implicated in the worst disaster in Konoha history. The way the Suna ninja Baki had been talking about the slaughter of his family had hinted that it was rather convenient for Konoha. Worse, on further reflection on the subject, it was entirely possible that it was convenient for Konoha, especially if his father had actually been guilty of what he'd been accused of. After all of that, he didn't want to see the Uzumaki again today because he just knew that the boy would say or do something that would send his world spinning out of control, and he needed control now that he didn't really have much else. He had little to no choice in the matter however, hence his stalling. As Tetsuo made his way to the team's meeting place, he reflected that it felt strange not having Kakashi who'd taken a mission to remedy his depleted resources by his side. After 2 months with the man, he was happily willing to call him a good friend rather than an acquaintance that he considered to be in his loose circle of friends and fully understood why the Haddock's former Anbu squadmates loyally followed him despite the fact that he was aloof and came off as rather a jerk to those who didn't know him even long after the man had ostensibly retired from the dark side. When he'd gotten home a couple days earlier, he'd learned that the old saying of absence makes the heart grow fonder had held true in his case. Though it was probably not the proper method for dealing with the problems he and his wife had been going through adjusting to the fact that there were 3 rather than 2 and it wasn't just about them anymore, it had seemed to work in this case since the old arguments hadn't started back up the instant he'd come through the door. His wife, who'd been busy the last time he'd come home before he'd been sent back out again a day later, had been overjoyed to see him, as had his daughter who still remembered who he was, despite his irrational fears that she might not considering the fact that he'd been gone for a much longer period than at any other point in her rather short life. That bit of family time after they'd managed to wipe the slate somewhat clean following the break from his and his wife's routine of arguing over everything from what was being served for dinner to who was going to get the baby that was crying loud enough to wake the dead, and his success in fulfilling his promise to Naruto had gone a long way towards uplifting his flagging spirits. In fact, he was so happy today that the thought of trying to teach his other students didn't fill him with a new sense of dread as he anticipated discovering something else that had gone wrong with their previous training. Despite the fact that he'd had 2 months to work on the worst of it, he was constantly discovering new and exceedingly unpleasant surprises in regards to the Haruno girl and the Uchiha boy. Sasuke and Sakura were already at the meeting point when he arrived. Based on their posture, they were both waiting for something that they were looking forward to with a sense of dread. When he'd arrived, their heads simultaneously turned towards him before they sagged slightly in relief. "Was there something you were looking for?" he asked. "Naruto," Sakura replied. "He's gone to take the Chunin exams in Suna. He'll be back either in January or February," he replied. Both of his students sagged further in relief at this news, though Sasuke was better at masking this than Sakura, probably because he'd been trained in the art of stoicism practically from the day he was born. "Well, don't look so relieved that he's gone," he snapped, his good mood rapidly dissipating. "I'm going to be working the both of you twice as hard in order to get you in shape for the next exam cycle, which I expect the both of you to pass." Naruto sighed as he readjusted the rainproof tarp which his sleeping bag rested on half of, with the rest folded over it to form a makeshift shelter. The rainstorm raging above the desert sands halfway between the Fire Country border and Suna had seemingly popped up out of nowhere, but since it was winter, something like that was to be expected. He would have been resting in the nearby tent, but he'd heard rumors about these kinds of teams, but seeing one firsthand was kind of disturbing. It wasn't nearly as disturbing as it could have been though. His temporary teammates for the Chunin exams were consenting adults who were above even the civilian age of consent, so there wasn't really a problem there. Due to the fact that he'd been a student of one of the legendary Sannin and experienced the often too swift nature of wartime promotions, where survivors tended to be bumped up in rank until they found a mission that killed them, the sensei was nearly the same age as his students and was pretty much only sensei in name alone at this point. So, it wasn't like his teammates were the victims of some pervert twice their age who'd been taking advantage of them for years. All in all, nowhere near as disturbing as it could have been, and knowing what shinobi life was like, he could see how it had come about even if he didn't approve. Battle tended to either bring people together or tear them apart. Many marriages had been made on the battlefield, and a large number of those marriages had fallen apart off the battlefield when the fight for one's life and one's comrades' lives was over, and the realities of daily life, such as who'd go and get the groceries and exactly who would be cooking dinner amongst other things set in. Some marriages that had their roots in war or missions gone either horribly right or horribly wrong hadn't fallen apart shortly after everyone got home and was stuck living together however. Considering the ages of his temporary teammates and their sensei, it was entirely possible that this team was one of the couples groups that had fallen for each other during the war and stayed together since, though what they had couldn't strictly be called a marriage in the legal sense. If it wasn't for that whole all-guy thing that was giving him the creeps due to his own preferences which were firmly heterosexual, he'd almost think it was cute how they'd tried to stay together since the war. Sabotaging their chances for promotion when they took the Chunin exams so they could stay together with their sensei, who'd risen through the ranks about as swiftly as Kakashi, who was about a year older than him, rather than be separated by differing missions, wasn't cute at all in his opinion however. For one, odds were that they'd sabotage things this time around as well, and it would put his chances for promotion, which he was actually serious about, at risk. Grumbling over the fact that he'd gotten assigned to someone's group marriage rather than a proper ninja team, Naruto drew something in the damp sand in front of him more for something to do because he wasn't exactly feeling tired. Midokado Himura knew that he should have left hours ago, but there was always another excuse that kept him from leaving, and now the hour had grown very, very late. Though they were at an age when it would mostly be ignored or thought of as cute, there were those who wouldn't overlook his being here most if not all of the night. With him holding as high a position in the village as he did, the rumors that would result from this could be ruinous for both of them. I really should be going, he said as Hitomi offered him another cup of tea. Nonsense. Hitomi replied, her eyes flashing dangerously as she pulled one of the senbon she used to hold her silver bun in place from said bun. If you think I'm going to let you go out there in that freezing rain and catch your death of cold for the sake of our reputations, then you're an idiot. Besides, she added in a softer tone. It's going to start snowing soon. He blinked at her in surprise, wondering what had made her say that. Fire Country was mostly centered in the sort of climate where it usually rained late autumn to early spring and then dried out in preparation for a long, hot summer. Konoha was smack dab in the middle of this region. Snow was a rarity that Konoha usually saw maybe once or twice in deep winter if at all. Hitomi laughed and said, don't tell me you've become so dependent on those newscasters who use those newfangled devices that are wrong half the time to tell you what weather's supposed to be that you've forgotten our old lessons. Remembering the lessons that Hitomi had been talking about, Himura closed his eyes and put everything but his immediate environment out of his mind. He breathed out and then he breathed in. Despite the fact that he was in a warm house that smelled of many things including tea, furniture polish and Hitomi, he could faintly sense that edge to the air that was seeping into the house from every opening it could find, which he'd long ago learned meant that snow was on the way. As he listened, he could hear the sound of raindrops growing fainter and fainter as things froze until eventually. The flakes started off small, but steadily grew until they were larger than his thumbnail. There was just enough ambient light coming from the house and the nearby street lights outside that he could make out just about each and every snowflake as they drifted towards the earth, which was slowly but steadily turning white. Shall we? Hitomi asked as she picked up the teapot and their mugs and started to carry them towards the back porch. Smiling, he got up and followed her. While Naruto had been getting rained on and Himura and Hitomi were watching the snow, Shimura Danzo had been taking his late night sleep break so he would be able to function the next day. Should he find room in his schedule, he would take another similar break during the slowest part of the day and be up and ready for the busiest part of the night. Considering the nature of both sides of his work, he was usually careful enough to schedule his sleep around the least busy parts of the day. This didn't always work out to his satisfaction however. There were any number of times which he missed one or more sleep breaks due to the fact that the Hokage who himself was bored would often assign him to menial tasks or degrading missions because he obviously looked bored and needed something to do. That, and there were sometimes unforeseen events which needed to be responded to immediately that would catch him out of the blue. Tonight was one of those nights. He'd managed to get no more than 3 hours sleep before one of his agents who he'd put on assignment came in and personally reported yet another problem with the target he was tracking. Great, he thought sourly. I haven't even gotten the team yet and they're already causing me trouble. Hauling himself out of bed, he dressed and headed towards the root infirmary where one of the members of his future Genin team had been brought. While Hiruzen had been scrambling to find enough jounin to cover the potential teams from the remedial class that would be graduating in January, he'd thrown his own name into the pool. It hadn't immediately been rejected, though he had gotten a look and a comment that his new students would not be rude. He accepted the Hokage's terms, and Hiruzen had placed his name down on the list alongside those of a couple of other retired shinobi who'd stopped taking missions in order to give the younger lot a chance, but had never actually filed the paperwork that made things official. After collecting and going over the profiles of the students who had been returned to the academy for a second and last chance at being on an active ninja team, he had selected the 3 students that he would be openly teaching. Not being as foolish as the number of young jounin who put their names in the hopes of either getting students from one of the major clans and the prestige that came with training them or getting the best and training them to be the next Sannin, he took care not to select any that stood out too much or came from families who would kick up too much of a fuss if he found it necessary to break his students down before he built them back up. After selecting his team and a couple of potential alternates, should unforeseen complications arise, and flat out informing Hiruzen that these three would be his students, he had set a watch on each of them. The watch on the boy named Hibachi who'd fallen into a downward spiral since his father's demise had come to inform him that he'd been forced to bring the boy in for treatment for hypothermia due to the fact that the brat had rather stupidly sat by his father's grave through a bout of freezing rain which had turned to snow until he'd collapsed. When he arrived in the medbay, a rather weak Hibachi who had a heated blanket wrapped around him lay there giving him a sullen glare. The next time you try to dishonor your father's memory by not showing the sense that even a chicken is born with, I will leave you outside to freeze to death. He said, deciding to let the boy know what was what from the get-go, since he didn't have the time or the patience to deal with the boy's self-pity. The boy gave a barely audible grumble which was either an expression of ingratitude or a typically adolescent, "What do you know about my suffering?" type remark. Though he was sorely tempted to give the boy what for, everything he'd read about the boy and everything the observers had seen had indicated that this would be the wrong response. He decided to tell one of his more inspiring stories instead. This approach had worked well with Shin, though the boy was far more emotional than he would like. When Konoha first started, people had been stunned when the Senju and the Uchiha had joined together to found a village. He said. When they allowed other clans to join them and didn't try to force the newcomers to become a subservient underclass, people began to believe the Senju and the Uchiha had gone soft. Believing that Konoha was vulnerable and that they had a chance, the first band of raiders tried their luck when I was 3. My grandfather was killed in the ensuing fight. This statement seemed to catch the boy's attention and then lose it, as he probably sounded just like one of those older people who told someone who recently lost someone about their loss in order to prove that things will get better. 10 years later, another band of raiders decided to test the village's defenses and it was my father's turn to die. He said. Several years after that, the Nidaime himself gave his life so my and the Sandaime's teams might live to fight another day. That last apparently rather startled the boy who it would seem did not know the exact circumstances surrounding Senju Tabarama's death. Everyone knew he'd made a noble sacrifice and had made his enemy pay for killing him in blood, but that was about all the general populace knew about what had happened. On that day, I vowed that Konoha would never be as vulnerable as it had at that point in the First War and every point prior to it. I vowed that nobody would ever be as strong as us and that if anyone tried to take any of our territory, they would have to pay for every inch of that land in their own blood. He said, finishing his tale which was true but left one or two details out. Based on the look in the Hibachi boy's eyes, he may have gotten to him. For now. Whether or not what he told him would stick remained to be seen. Either way, the boy would not be seen in the Root Infirmary for hypothermia a second time. It was the 26th of December when Naruto and what he'd collectively dubbed Kabuto's spouse, since the term interchangeably applied to all members of Kabuto's team, reached the gates of Suna. The day was far colder than he would have expected for a desert, but then again Suna was high desert. If it had rained more often, Suna would likely have seen snow. Since it rarely rained, Suna didn't have her see snow. Fortunately, Naruto had brought cold weather gear as well as his rain gear, both of which he might need considering the fact that the winter was Suna's rainy season. What little there was of it. The trip to the Kazukiya's residence administration building was relatively uneventful if one discounted the stairs and the occasional ninja backtracking and following them again so they could get an extra stair in. While Naruto found the fact that the majority of attention was directed at him annoying, it wasn't nearly as bad as things in Konoha had been when he was little. In Konoha, he had been either completely ignored or glared at with few exceptions. The most notable of these having been the old man, Iruka-sensei, and his quasi-friends from the academy. Things had improved over the last 2 years, but he still received the occasional glare from the civilians who wanted far less to do with him than his average colleague. Naruto and the team he was subbing on eventually reached Suna's administration complex in order to check in, and the stares from random passers-by were replaced by stares from Sunagakure's administration ninja. The stares were joined by glares from a ninja team from Iwagakure that had arrived at the same time that they did. Fortunately, the desk chunin whose job it was to sign them in had stopped staring at him long enough to check the team in, give them their information packets, and send them on their way. As they were exiting the building, Naruto spotted Gaara walking past. "Sensei, may I?" Naruto asked. "Have fun." Naruto's substitute sensei replied. "Just remember to meet us back at our accommodations at curfew. And, remember to knock first." Yoroi added. Shuddering, Naruto replied, "I will." "Odd, I will." Naruto muttered under his breath, remembering the time he'd accidentally interrupted a tender embrace between Yoroi and the team sensei. There were things you could never unsee. Hey Gaara, wait up. Naruto yelled when he'd realized that Gaara was disappearing into the distance and that he would lose the other Jinchuriki if he didn't catch up with him soon. Sasuke dabbed at his split lip, cursing the day that Naruto had brought him to Udatein Kaharu's attention. Thanks to the little lesson Naruto had volunteered him for, the woman seemed to have it out for him. He'd encountered the woman twice since that lesson. The first time, he could have sworn he'd heard the old bitch call him a little shit under her breath. The second time, which had been when his sensei had dragged him and Sakura to the tower to get an assignment today, the woman had decided that she didn't like the look he was giving her and had decided that a repeat of his lesson would be in order. His only warning that he would again be benefiting from the wisdom the great Udatein Kaharu had gained through extensive experience had been when she'd shoeshine to a spot that was 2 inches in front of his face and batted him into the far wall. Kaharu had then explained why you don't give the enemy any warning that you are about to attack, while she thoroughly trounced him, making his defeat look completely effortless on her part despite the fact that he was mid-chunin skill-wise. The lesson had ended when the Hokage had calmly and quietly pointed out that the mission assignment desk wasn't the proper venue for such a lesson and suggested that they take it out to one of the training grounds since that was what they were there for. It was after the lesson had ended that Sasuke had learned that the source of the pain he was in was the result of a black eye, a split lip, and numerous bruises all over his body. He had excused himself to a nearby restroom to deal with the split lip so he wouldn't have to go through the embarrassment of walking all the way across town with blood dripping down his chin. As he added an antiseptic to the wound on his lip that hurt his pride more than anything else, he was startled by a loud pounding on the bathroom door. "Hurry it up in there." Sasuke's completely unsympathetic sensei yelled. "We have a mission to complete. Get your hand off of my wallet, Satoshi." Kurosaki Hiro yelled as he stabbed down towards the pocket that contained his wallet with the kunai he normally kept tucked in the sleeve of his coat. "How did you know it was me?" Kamiya Satoshi asked as he pulled his hand out of Kurosaki's pocket an instant before it would have been stabbed, causing Kurosaki to stab his wallet. "Since we're on a mission, you're the only pickpocket for miles who's dumb enough to try stealing from a ninja," Kurosaki replied, scowling down at the newly made hole in his pocket and the evidence that the wallet wasn't quite as advertised as the kunai had dented the special metal plate that was supposed to hold up to such things. "Well, there's always next time," Satoshi said cheerfully. "Next time, I'll get that special explosive tag working properly and you'll be missing fingers," Kurosaki grumbled. "Say," Satoshi said, moving the conversation on to another topic before this one ended in a fight. "Do you think that Naruto's reached Suna by now?" "He should be, unless those overage genin have held him up," Kurosaki replied, almost wincing at Naruto's misfortune at being on a team of 5-time losers. Considering the fact that Kabuto was pretty much the best ninja on that team, things weren't looking good for Naruto's chances of promotion. "I hear that the gambling pool for the Chunin exams opens early outside of the villages," Satoshi said, getting that look in his eyes that usually preceded the loss of a good deal of money on his part. Satoshi was a gambler and not a very good one at that. He wasn't as bad as the legendary sucker and could occasionally recoup his losses. But, for the most part, he lost money and frequently had to get more through either fair means or foul. "We don't have time to stop," Kurosaki replied. "We need to get this mission done quickly so we can finish up our remedial homework for the week." "Damn Naruto," Satoshi grumbled. "We're Chunin and we're stuck doing academy stuff because he had to go and catch that traitor." "It's not all bad," Kurosaki replied. "I've finally learned why that one explosive tag I'd been trying to make since I graduated the academy kept failing." "You and your explosive tags," Satoshi grumbled. "Meh, it's a safer hobby than pickpocketing ninjas," Kurosaki replied before giving Satoshi a playful shove. Despite the little thieving habit that kept him on his toes, Satoshi was someone Kurosaki could relax around. They'd been friends before and Satoshi had been there and lost friends that day too, so he understood better than anyone else their age. It had taken him a long time to reach the point where he could roughhouse with Satoshi like he'd used to though. Satoshi shoved Kurosaki back and the fight that ensued was a great deal more playful than it would have been had it started earlier when Kurosaki had caught trying to steal his wallet. Again. Hamizuki Suzume did her best to keep the grin off her face as she anticipated what was coming next. Today, she wasn't escorting a client or playing ranger at a nature preserve. Technically, she should be heading home from a just completed mission, but she'd spotted an opportunity for revenge when she'd run into a certain white-haired pervert by chance and had decided to take it. She'd shamelessly cribbed Naruto's notes when she'd built the trap, but since she knew it was one of Naruto's improvements on one of Madara's designs, she knew that it was one of the best in the world. Just a little closer. Snap. Zap. POW. Sproink. Sucks. I believe this belongs to you. A singed and leering Jiraiya said as he appeared in front of Suzume and handed her the bra she'd used to bait the trap. Losing all control of her temper, Suzume launched herself at Jiraiya, intent on killing him with her bare hands. It had taken her hours to set up that trap. Adding insult to injury, Jiraiya not only proved how much a Sannin outclassed a mere Chunin, but he showed that he wasn't taking the fight anywhere near seriously as he spent more time practically groping her than actually fighting and ended the whole farce by tying her to a tree with the bra she tried to trap him with. One day, Suzume swore as she struggled to get her hands free from the bra that Jiraiya had somehow tampered with during the short encounter. One day, I'm going to bring that pervert down, or my name isn't Kamizuki Suzume. Jiraiya grinned as he perched himself well away from the young Kunoichi, who would soon free herself once she figured out how to break the seal he'd put on her bra. The kid had potential and would be going places if she ever got her temper in check. For now though, she'd given him tons of material to work with. Of course he would be editing out the part where the young Kunoichi had screamed "Die pervert, die," as that didn't fit with the tone of his books. But the trap baited with a bra was prime material. Bara honestly wasn't sure how to react. There had been a time when he would have begged and pleaded for someone his age to play with him rather than run for the hills. That time had long since passed. Now, long after that time had passed, there was someone who was following him around, begging him to come and play with him. That someone was the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, which was causing his mother to give him some seriously mixed signals, but still. The only reason he hadn't killed the pest that continued to follow him around and ended his dilemma before he had to think about it too much had been because it wasn't worth the lecture he'd get from his father over starting a war. If he killed Konoha's Jinchuriki on Suna's soil, there was absolutely no question there would be a war. A war that Suna wasn't prepared for because his father had dropped Suna's forces back to pre-build-up levels until he figured out how to respond to Konoha's increasing militarization, which made the village look less and less like the easy pickings that the Kazukiage had been counting on when he'd started arranging the plot to invade Konoha in order to regain Suna's standing and bring more funding and missions back to the village. "Come on, you're clearly not busy," stated the blonde-haired Jinchuriki, who was still trailing 3 feet behind him, despite the fact that he'd made it clear that he was giving him the cold shoulder. "We've walked around the village 3 times already and you haven't said one word about being on a mission." "No." Gaara flatly stated for what had seemed like the millionth time since Naruto had started trailing after him, inviting and later begging him to come and play. The time for playing had passed. The time for seeking love and friendship had long passed. People had proven themselves to be utterly untrustworthy bastards. His purpose was to kill those who would confirm his existence, not to run around playing hide and seek or whatever with Konoha's Jinchuriki. Thanks for watching, Shinobi Squad. If you enjoyed this what if, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next twist. Drop your theories in the comments, I'm always reading. Want more Naruto heat? Check out the other videos on the channel. Stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember even shadow clones need love. Peace out, Shinobi.